This is Audible.
You're listening to the audio production of Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House by Carol M. Swain and Christopher J. Shore, published by Be the People Books and read by Carol M. Swain and Nathan Gerard. Ben Carson's foreword read by Winston Jackson. Please note that you may download an accompanying PDF that provides enhanced materials for this audiobook. To download the PDF, please visit carolmswain.com/blackeyepdf.
Dedication to my past, present, and future students who deserve a better world than the one we are creating through humanism, and to the Americans who decried what has happened to America. Carol Swain.
To Ibram X. Kendi, whose work provides so much fodder for this book, Chris Shore.
Songwriter Ray Stevens, Everything is Beautiful lyrics, Ahab Music Company, Incorporated. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in His sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Everything is beautiful in its own way, like a starry summer night on a snow-covered winter day. And everybody's beautiful in their own way. Under God's heaven, the world's gonna find a way. There is none so blind as he who will not see. We must not close our minds. We must let our thoughts be free. For every hour that passes by, you know the world gets a little bit older. It's time to realize that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and everything is beautiful in its own way, like a starry summer night on a snow-covered winter's day. And everybody's beautiful in their own way. Under God's heaven, the world's gonna find a way. We shouldn't care about the length of his hair or the color of his skin. Don't worry about what shows from without, but the love that lives within. We're gonna get it all together now. Everything's gonna work out fine. Just take a little time. Look on the good side, my friend. Straighten it out in your mind. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. Acts 17:26.
Forward. History is full of hinge moments. Those times when someone choosing to act or not act, or an event going this way or that, have profound consequences. Take George Washington's short-circuiting the Newburgh Conspiracy. John Adams's choosing to peacefully hand control of the executive branch to his ideological opponent. Abraham Lincoln's fighting to keep the Southern states in the Union. Or the American people's choosing to support Ronald Reagan's efforts to smash the Soviet Union and its communist aims. In each of these situations, the outcome was not preordained. Had things turned out differently, the world likely would be a much worse place. We are at a similar hinge point today. Our country is fractured and in danger of coming apart at the seams. The misguided ideology of critical race theory is corrupting our institutions, dividing Americans by race and pitting them against one another based on that arbitrary characteristic. So, the American people are faced with a choice. Do the better angels of our nature unite and guide the country back toward the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights? Or do we succumb to the forces of darkness and division, which will lead to further social conflict and a nation that cannot afford to be any more divided? There is only one just outcome in this fight. Our only option is to treat people as individuals, with their race being only one characteristic of the complex web of traits that makes up who they are, and an unimportant one at that. But critical race theory does not allow this. In fact, it requires the opposite. For critical race theory, the only characteristic that matters is a person's race. And individuals are not individuals, but members of racial groups who are only judged collectively as a racial group. Any differences between racial groups are exclusively the result of racism, as opposed to any other factor. But just because there is only one just outcome does not mean that outcome will prevail. While the premises of critical race theory are self-evidently false, both in theory and in fact, critical race theory remains on the march. Its advocates are gaining strength, indoctrinating our children and infiltrating institutions at an alarming rate. The forces fighting for the just outcome are on the defensive. This book and its authors are needed allies in this battle. Black Eye for America clearly and cogently explains how and why the embrace of critical race theory will bankrupt our nation both spiritually and intellectually. The authors dissect the purported intellectual framework of critical race theory, exposing it for what it is, a warmed-over Marxism that substitutes race for class, but otherwise embraces the same failed ideas and assumptions of an ideology that sent 100 million people to their graves. The book also explains how critical race theory is anti-American, anti-liberal in the classical sense, and anathema to the Judeo-Christian values that are the bedrock of the American ethos. While neo-Marxist in theory, critical race theory is neo-Jim Crow in practice, having simply swapped which race is favored and which race is disfavored. The book provides a helpful roadmap for countering the creep of critical race theory and its pernicious influence. It outlines strategies and tactics to fight back, from how to channel the idea of insurgency to achieve much-needed reforms to how to exit institutions that cannot be fixed. Dr. Swain and Dr. Shore have done the world, and Americans in particular, a great service by writing this book. I look forward to people of good faith using the arguments within it to fight against the forces of destruction and bring our country back into the light. Dr. Benjamin Carson, Chairman and founder of the American Cornerstone Institute.
Chapter 1, Introduction. Why we came together to write this book. I am a former university professor who for many years has been warning people about critical race theory and its impact on our society. As a professor of both political science and law, I have watched CRT metastasize like a cancer on college and university campuses. Alongside political correctness, another blight on civil discourse, CRT has stoked racial turmoil and helped to spawn cancel culture, safe spaces, trigger warnings, racially segregated dorms and graduations, and, on some campuses, separate course sections by race. Universities are no longer the marketplaces of ideas they once were. I fear for my country now that CRT has migrated from college campuses to society at large. In 2017, I took early retirement and left the university environment to focus my time and energy on issues that would impact a larger public. As an author, public speaker, political commentator, and entrepreneur, I dedicate my time to reaching and equipping people with the information they need to fight back against the creeping rot destroying our nation. As I frequently tell people, the world is my classroom. From the media platform I have been given, I sound an alarm when I see danger and deception in American political and religious life. I am writing this book precisely for this purpose. I am deeply troubled by changes that are reversing gains our nation has made in the areas of civil rights and equal opportunity. My concern for America, coupled with my visibility as a scholar and as a public intellectual from humble beginnings, led me to join forces with Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center. Woodson Forum 1776 unites in fall 2019 after the New York Times launched its controversial 1619 project, which made false, sweeping claims about slavery and America's founding. Our united efforts led to the 2021 publication of Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. In December of 2020, President Donald Trump appointed me to a 2-year term as vice chair of the 1776 Commission. Our charge was to write a report on core principles of the American founding and how these principles might be used to teach patriotism and civics in preparation for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Our committee met twice before it was dissolved by Trump's successor, President Joe Biden, on Inauguration Day as one of his first acts in office. I am pleased to report that the 1776 Commission is still active. We reconvened in May 2021 to develop a strategy to respond to critical race theory and how it is impacting our nation. Dr. James Lindsay, co-author of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, defines critical race theory as the, quote, belief that racism is the organizing principle of society, end quote. Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose's timely analysis traces the evolution of the dangerous ideologies ripping our nation apart. We have now reached a point in America where racism with a Marxist twist is state-sanctioned and enforced by our major social institutions. Indeed, our public and private K-12 schools are ground zero in the battle. White children are taught to be ashamed of their skin color on the grounds that they unjustly benefit from a, quote, white supremacist system established by their ancestors to oppress racial and ethnic minorities. Black children are taught that they are victims of a thoroughly and permanently racist system. American children of all races are taught that they live in an evil nation that has wreaked great harm on the world. In December 2019, I was approached by a group of parents of Christian students enrolled in Lipscomb Academy, a private Church of Christ-affiliated institution in Nashville, Tennessee. Lipscomb Academy operates under the auspices of Lipscomb University and was formed by its board of trustees. These parents were troubled by the lower school's decision to hire a dean of intercultural development. The young woman described herself as a radical liberator, educator, minister, and organizer, an activist. One of her first acts was to create a Black student union. Until this action, the school did not have a history of separating students by race. Parents were rightly concerned that this newly hired dean was an active supporter of Black Lives Matter and had a personal website with statements condemning white people and Church of Christ doctrine on the role of women in the church. I wrote 3 essays addressing this issue. Does progress require shaming and embarrassing our children? Critical race theory and Christian education, and critical race theory is rooted in cultural Marxism. Several of the school's administrators left their positions, but critical race theory continues to influence Lipscomb University. In spring 2021, prominent critical race theorist Dr. Ibram X. Kendi was featured as the premier speaker at a Christian Scholars Conference at Lipscomb University. When this information was revealed, The first impulse of the university was to hide it by removing the announcement from its website. Lipscomb later reinstated the advertisement after a conservative newspaper revealed their actions. Using a racist ideology that masquerades as anti-racism to divide Americans by skin color is repugnant. Every parent should watch shaming videos such as Your Brain on Drug Policy and The Unequal Opportunity Race to better understand what is happening in our children's schools. Shockingly, these videos are shown to middle school and high school age students, kids ill-equipped to handle heavy-duty messaging about racism and collective guilt. In some schools, the new quest for equity in place of equal opportunity and color blindness is resulting in the removal of advanced placement courses and other opportunities for gifted children. There's also a move to force equity by removing entrance exams and testing for admission to elite schools. A corollary to critical race theory is intersectionality. This is a theory asserting that overlapping sources of oppression compound one another, rendering racial and ethnic minorities, gays and lesbians, and economically disadvantaged groups even more marginalized and victimized by society in proportion to their accumulating victim identities. Intersectionality advocates claim that the lived experiences of more marginalized people carry more weight than those of less marginalized people. Indeed, marginalized people's experiences are claimed to carry more weight than empirical evidence. In writing this book, I've teamed up with Dr. Chris Shore, a young man who, as a student, discovered me and worked to quantify some of the ideas in my 2002 book, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration. In Black Eye for America, we hope to make it easier for people to understand what is happening and how they can more effectively resist what we consider to be a dangerous and evil agenda that rises to the level of a civil rights threat. This is the time, we contend, for people of all races and ethnicities to lock arms to fight against this worldview, one that is destroying healthy race relations and making it more difficult for minorities to build upon the successes they achieved in previous generations. Critical race theory now permeates our churches, military, and intelligence agencies, as well as our institutions of higher learning and even K through 12. It needs to be stopped in its tracks by knowledgeable people imbued with courage and the lofty principles that made America the envy of the free world.
Christopher J. Shore's perspective. I recently came to this topic as part of my dissertation research addressing the threat posed by white nationalism to conservative politics in the United States. That research led me first to Dr. Carol Swain's definitive work on white nationalism, and then, fortunately, to Carol herself. From an academic standpoint, I was intrigued by the political implications of rising white identification and white consciousness. For a variety of reasons, racial identity has been less salient for whites in America than for members of other groups. However, recent research demonstrates that this is beginning to change. As a personal matter, I was, and remain, deeply concerned as to the effects of racial identity politics on our nation's integrity. Being a U.S. Marine, there are no ex-Marines, I take these things personally. The role of public discourse was among the several factors I considered as possible contributors to rising white identification. A recent torrent of condemnation of white people and of white identity in popular media, along with equivalent, if not greater, condemnations of American society as white supremacist and systemically racist, caught my attention. Presumably, I thought, whites had taken notice. Such rhetoric had been imported into American media and culture from formerly obscure, radical academic fields of studies such as critical race theory, whiteness studies, and from related cultural Marxist studies fields. Like most Americans, I was both aware and generally contemptuous of political correctness and of identity politics. However, it was clear that the CRT phenomenon was something else entirely. CRT is far from anti-racism, the term adopted by its proponents. It is, rather, explicitly racist, demeaning designated oppressor and oppressed groups alike. CRT condemns people in the former category for the alleged sins of their birth, compelling them, in practice, to humiliate themselves in absurd, ritualistic fashions. CRT infantilizes and denigrates people in the latter category, describing them as hapless victims of a society that belongs to someone else. Previous, that is, authentic, champions of racial equality fought to incorporate people of color into the story of America, perhaps the second greatest story ever told. CRT inverts that story by declaring exceptions to the rule, cases where America failed to live up to its founding and purpose, to be the rule itself. See the 1619 Project. In so doing, CRT degrades the object toward which advocates of racial justice strove, and, especially in regard to people of color, it diminishes the value of American citizenship. It is my and our sincere hope that this book helps to inform readers of CRT's pernicious influence. Most importantly, we hope to mobilize readers to resist and defeat CRT wherever they find it, in politics, in workplaces, in schools, especially in children's schools, in churches, and everywhere else it rears its ugly head.
Where we stand. We want to be clear up front about our stance. We acknowledge the nation's tragic racial past and the strides that have been made to create a more just society. Women, as well as racial and ethnic minorities, have benefited from efforts to address and correct past and present discrimination. Our civil rights laws and affirmative action as law and policy were part of our nation's efforts to create opportunities and a just society. What is happening today goes far beyond earlier efforts to remedy racial disparities using preferential policies, i.e., affirmative action. We both are devout Christians who believe God created one human race and that the distinctions we see are man-made. We acknowledge that racism and prejudice are sinful acts that are always wrong and should always be condemned regardless of the race or ethnicity of the perpetrator. In making this statement, we reject arguments made by critical race theorists and other leftists who falsely claim that only whites can be racist. According to this narrative, being born into the white race automatically makes one a blood-guilty white supremacist in possession of ill-gotten gains derived from racial oppression. We also reject the bullying and shaming of white people, just as all decent people reject such acts of racism against Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans. Whether it is against whites or Blacks, racial discrimination is counter to who we are as Americans, and it violates state and federal civil rights laws as well as the principles enshrined in the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. We are staunchly opposed to political activism and indoctrination disguised as education and to so-called anti-racism programs and training that in reality use racism as an attempted remedy for racial and ethnic disparities. The path forward. Our book is divided into 8 chapters. In this first chapter, we have addressed why we believe that this book is now urgently needed. In Chapter 2, we address how, in theory and in practice, critical race theory, CRT, divides Americans and pits them against each other and against their own country. Chapter 3 explains CRT's historical and scholarly background. In chapters 4 and 5, we argue that CRT is irreconcilable with traditional American principles, specifically with America's classical, liberal, and Christian inheritance. Most importantly, in Chapter 6, we argue that CRT is inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause and dependent on how it is implemented, that it can violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Education Amendments added to it in 1972. CRT additionally often compels speech and action contrary to First Amendment protections. In Chapter 7, we account for CRT's rapid spread through the major institutions of American society and develop several big-picture strategies for resisting its pernicious effects. We conclude in Chapter 8 with 10 specific proposals, including policies that need your support as well as actions you can take to personally combat CRT. Our targeted audiences for this book are anyone affected or who will be affected by the spread of CRT. These include children, parents with school-age children, including college students, and people who care about opportunities for children, working adults, religious observers, and anyone concerned with religious liberty, social media users, and anyone concerned with freedom of expression, people who consume media and culture, patriotic Americans who believe in the principles of e pluribus unum, out of many, one, and people who believe that truth exists and that there is an objective, real world. If you fall into one or more of these categories, this book is written for you. Chapter 2. What is critical race theory? Critical race theory is a fundamentally racist worldview predicated on the claim that racism is in the DNA of American institutions and society, as well as, in effect, in the DNA of white Americans. It sees minorities, especially Black Americans, as victims of systemic racism permeating a vast network of impenetrable institutional structures and cultural stereotypes, all created by whites to give themselves unearned advantages. This depressing narrative states that government-sponsored racism did not end in the 1960s when Congress passed 3 major civil rights bills to address the effects of Jim Crow racism. Evidently, nothing of real consequence took place following the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which mandated the advertising of jobs and banned discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. Likewise, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Open Housing Act of 1968 did little to deinstitutionalize racial discrimination in American law and society. In reality, the civil rights laws of this era ended institutional racism sanctioned by the government by law, creating equal opportunities for millions of women and for racial minorities. The racism that remained in the system was individual in nature. Laws cannot strike prejudice from people's hearts. However, here too, great progress has been made. In 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of marriages between blacks and whites. By 2013, approval of interracial marriage had risen to 87% across the board and to 84% among whites. Today, Americans report far greater political than racial animosity. The success of millions of racial and ethnic minorities and the election and re-election of a black president, Barack Obama, are testament to America's great racial progress. Racism in America has been overwhelmingly desystematized. However, critical race theory now threatens to undo this great work and drag our country backward towards racial antipathy and separation. CRT proponents have jettisoned the quest for racial reconciliation and a colorblind society where individuals are free to pursue their dreams for a better life. In place of equal opportunity, CRT demands equity, equal outcomes by group. To this end, CRT demands discrimination in favor of some groups and against others. In practice, CRT advocates often demand more than equity. That is, permanent advantages for so-called victims as they work to turn the tables on oppressors. CRT targets white people, singling out a racial group for mistreatment. The blatant racial discrimination makes CRT the greatest civil rights issue of our time. CRT proponents justify racial discrimination on their terms by claiming that whites derive tremendous unearned advantages from the color of their skin. Whites, they claim, possess vested property interests in their whiteness, which they must divest themselves of in pursuit of equity and to shed their innate and inherited racial guilt. This process, becoming anti-racist, entails confessing complicity in racism and challenging other whites who likewise benefit from the institutional structures that allegedly perpetuate white supremacy. White people who claim to be innocent of the charge of racism and discrimination are deemed guilty of harboring hidden racial biases. It does not matter if the white person is a descendant of abolitionists, including those who risked their lives sheltering runaway slaves in the Underground Railroad, or if he or she hails from a philanthropic family that gave millions of dollars to set up black schools and universities. White people are oppressors by definition. Christianity, and Western civilization more broadly, also falls into the oppressor category. On the other hand, racial and ethnic minorities, especially black people, are described as helpless victims in need of liberation from pervasive and persistent systemic racism. This patronizing account strips minorities of ownership and control over their own lives while attributing to whites seemingly godlike powers to create every sort of malady in black homes and communities. CRT thus harms its intended beneficiaries by creating a sense of hopelessness while eroding decades of goodwill. In some cases, goodwill painstakingly built between members of different racial and ethnic groups. The narratives and lived experiences of blacks and other oppressed groups are elevated to a morally superior position over facts, science, and historical data that run counter to its core claims. Every minority is qualified to critique and re-educate others about systemic harms. A failure to agree with a proponent of CRT demands re-education rather than honest debate. Such struggle sessions harken back to CRT's Marxist origins. More on this to come. One of our points of emphasis concerns the spread of CRT throughout the educational arena. In K-12 schools, in particular, CRT rarely presents itself as CRT. Rather, it hides behind euphemistic labels such as anti-racism, educational equity, and cultural competency. Such methods are plainly deceitful. CRT advocates market themselves as engaging in a noble effort to combat systemic racism and to bring about a just and fair distribution of resources. In the process, rooting out pernicious, explicit or implicit, conscious or unconscious, racial biases. In practice, however, such instruction distorts American history to manufacture conclusions that would never hold up in honest debate where both sides were able to marshal evidence. Under CRT's inspired instruction in K-12 schools, American children are now taught to view racism as the cornerstone of American society. They are taught that whites dominate a racial hierarchy in America and exercise power as a group. White students, again children, are forced to confront their supposed hidden racism and its effect on society. In some school districts, claims of systemic racism are introduced to students in the first grade. By junior high, students are taught radical and divisive perspectives on whiteness. For example, that any white person who has failed to proclaim himself or herself as an anti-racist is a white supremacist, regardless of whether he or she rejects notions of racial superiority. Much like employees undergoing diversity, equity, and inclusion training, students are strongly discouraged from challenging these claims and have been punished for doing so. There's more. Concepts such as colorblindness, assimilation, and merit are dismissed as cynical means by which whites maintain their power and privilege in American society. The great achievements of the civil rights movement are consequently disparaged, as are the achievements of Black people who were not victims and who refused to see themselves as such. How this distorted vision of racial oppression will benefit American society, much less the children exposed to it, is anyone's guess. Will white children benefit from the self-loathing imparted to them by CRT instructors, or from the bullying, shaming, intimidation, and hostility they experience as a result of it? Will Black and other minority children benefit from instruction aimed at eviscerating their personal agency, their sense of being in control of their own lives, rather than being at the mercy of mercurial systemic forces? At this point, many readers of this book will ask themselves where this hateful and divisive ideology comes from. To answer this question, we first turn to two prominent CRT proponents, husband and wife Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, both of whom are law professors and social critics. Delgado, believed to be one of the founders of CRT, and Stefanczyk defined CRT as, quote, a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power, end quote. Studying race, racism, and power seems like a worthy pursuit, unlike, say, bullying children. How then might the one lead to the other? How is it that CRT scholars and activists go about their tasks? In simple terms, CRT views American society and government through a Marxist analytical lens, emphasizing group power and group conflict. Readers might be familiar with the standard Marxist worldview wherein the social order is defined by the oppression of workers, the proletariat, by the capitalist classes, the bourgeoisie. From this vantage point, social institutions, the economic, the social, the religious, security, cultural, etc., are all described as elements of capitalist oppression. Marxists consequently advocate upending the social order and reconstructing society along socialist lines. In CRT and in related fields, more on this later, racial and other social categories substitute for economic classes. White people, but also men, heterosexuals, and Christians are thus defined as oppressors, and people of color, but also women, gays, and religious minorities are defined as oppressed. Given that, Again, per Marxism, society and government are understood in terms of the domination of oppressed groups by oppressor groups. CRT treats racism as the organizing principle of society. Like their ideological forebears, CRT proponents aim to overthrow the social order on behalf of the oppressed. In this context, terms such as white supremacy and institutional racism are not restricted to historic systems such as Jim Crow or apartheid, but are used to describe contemporary Western and especially American society. CRT asserts that slavery and racial segregation were never contrary to American values. Instead, America was always and remains a white supremacist wolf, cloaked in a universalistic, classical, liberal sheep's clothing. Core American values such as individualism, liberty, meritocracy, property rights, and even procedural equality are viewed as expressions of white supremacy and or fig leaves to obscure white supremacy from public view. CRT proponents make expansive and exaggerated claims about racism in America. They find racism nearly everywhere, including in day-to-day interactions where the uninitiated might never think to look. For example, a stranger fell in to wave to you. In this view, racism is the primary cause for differences in outcomes between racial groups. For example, in income, educational attainment, incarceration, etc. It cannot be the case, for example, that a black-white difference in incarceration rates could exist independent of present-day racial oppression. For example, to the CRT advocate, pointing out that violent crime rates differ by racial group and that violent crime presumably has nothing to do with incarceration misses the point. All disparities reflect unequal, racist treatment somewhere in the system. This perspective is perhaps most prominently advanced by Ibram X. Kendi. Kendi explains, quote, "When I see racial disparities, I see racism. But I know for many racist Americans, when they see racial disparities, they see Black inferiority," end quote. He thus treats racial disparities, unequal outcomes, as a straightforward evidence of racial discrimination, unequal treatment. The system must be racist, Kendi argues, because absent racial discrimination, the only explanation for racial disparities must be that some racial groups are just better than others. For example, smarter, less criminally inclined, etc. This is a simplistic and disingenuous argument. In reality, group disparities are commonplace and do not always favor the so-called dominant groups. Moreover, there is a world of difference between saying X group is doing better or worse in some respect than Y group, and saying X group is superior to Y group. A given disparity between groups, however defined, may have any number of causes. It isn't obvious, for example, that the gender incarceration disparity reflects systemic matriarchal oppression, institutional misandry. Likewise, the fact that Asian Americans earn more on average than white Americans isn't obviously a product of white or Asian supremacy. Racial discrimination exists, including old-fashioned discrimination against racial minorities, the kind CRT opposes. But to support a claim of racial discrimination, one needs evidence of racial discrimination. Disparate group outcomes simply aren't that. Understanding this fact alone goes a long way towards countering a great many claims of systemic racism. Not to worry, though, CRT has plenty of other racisms to consider. Perhaps The most remarkable of these is colorblind racism. In layman's terms, colorblind racism is the racism embodied in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. It is the racism of attempting to view people primarily as members of some shared superordinate category, as Americans, human beings, children of God, rather than primarily as members of racial groups, color consciousness. If that description sounds implausible, consider the following from a Psychology Today article titled, "Colorblind Ideology is a Form of Racism." The article correctly describes colorblindness as an, quote, ideology that posits the best way to end discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity, end quote. It then acknowledges that colorblindness amounts to, quote, really taking MLK seriously on his call to judge people on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. It focuses on commonalities between people, such as their shared humanity, end quote. This article then goes on to explain why ignoring skin color is racist. In short, the CRT argument against colorblindness is an extension of the systemic racism concept. Colorblindness, like individualism and meritocracy, is said to obscure structures of racial oppression, allowing whites to continue to dominate people of color. CRT offers other noteworthy racisms, for example, new, cultural, and aversive racisms, and related concepts, for example, cultural appropriation. However, the most important remaining concept is the revision CRT makes to ordinary or unqualified racism. This revision is commonly referred to as the prejudice plus power definition of racism, which claims that only white people can be racist. The argument promotes the idea that only dominant group members possess the institutional power to link racial prejudice to meaningful action. That is, to do racist things. White people's racial prejudices, racism, thus carry extra weight compared to that of racial prejudices held by people of color, not racism. In practice, this theory means statements such as the following from Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan are not racist. Quote, white people deserve to die, and they know, so they think it's us coming to do it, end quote. Such a statement would be called racist if uttered by a white speaker substituting the word white for black. Hypocrisy is one of the hallmarks of CRT. It is also noteworthy that the prejudice plus power definition does not take into account power differences at the individual level. This means that if a racially prejudiced person of color in a position of power, for example, a politician, judge, or police officer, acts in a racially discriminatory or hateful manner, that person cannot be labeled racist. On this absurd edifice, CRT scholars additionally assert that all whites are racist. That disagreement or discomfort with this claim is also racist, white fragility, and white women's tears, and that indifference or disinterest in so-called anti-racism efforts is, wait for it, racist, white ignorance, and white complicity. CRT scholars go so far as to assert that it is impossible for white people to engage with people of color in good faith and that common ground can only be found under conditions of converging racial interests. As noted, these themes are now sufficiently mainstream that questioning them in public is risky. Recall that Kendi states, quote, I know that for many racist Americans, when they see racial disparities, they see Black inferiority, end quote. If this sounds like a threat, you aren't wrong. At the same time, courage is the mother of all virtues, and there are very good reasons why a true opponent of racism would stand up to CRT. The current political landscape. What happens in California rarely stays in California. As such, we should all be concerned by California's disturbing new ethnic studies curriculum, under which children will be taught to view America as a parasitic, white settler, colonist regime. The curriculum's stated purpose is to create activists, intellectuals who will go on to decolonize, deconstruct, and dismantle supposedly racist American institutions. As curriculum advocates explain, this program begins in the first grade because children are never too young for indoctrination. Indeed, their inherent empathy makes them especially vulnerable to it. Such efforts are not limited to the granola state. Rather, as documented by researchers such as Christopher Rufo and others, far-left indoctrination in American schools is legion. CRT activists are clear about their goals. Clarity and focus have given them enormous advantages over most Americans who are only beginning to notice what has been taking place around them. Indictments of America, rooted in historic grievances like slavery and Jim Crow, took on greater salience beginning in 2019. This is the year when the New York Times Magazine empowered Nicole Hannah-Jones to publish a series of essays called The 1619 Project. Hannah-Jones sought to reframe American history around racial oppression and to cast doubt on America's founding principles and values. To this end, she figuratively changed the date of America's founding from 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or 1789, the ratification of the Constitution, to 1619, the year in which the first African slaves were allegedly brought to American shores. Hannah-Jones even argued, much to the chagrin of historians and political scientists, that the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery. Within months, the discredited project had found its way into more than 4,500 American classrooms, where it is now helping to instruct the next generation of Americans to hate their country. Together, with publications like the New York Times, CRT scholars and advocates have worked to shape an environment where American society is now routinely condemned as systemically racist and white supremacist by members of the press, the entertainment industry, the political class, and major corporations. Open expressions of hostility towards white Americans, for example, condemnations of white privilege and attacks on whiteness, are commonplace as well. Astute media observers will likewise have noticed that violence committed by CRT-friendly far-left groups like BLM and Antifa is often excused, unlike violence committed by right-wing groups. For example, the Capitol Hill riot. CRT themes now pervade not only the education establishment, but also workplace diversity training. Media and corporate advertising and entertainment, including children's programming such as Sesame Street and Nickelodeon. In this environment, America recently experienced the worst riots in half a century. Cities were burned. Businesses were looted and destroyed. At least a dozen people were killed, and more than $1 billion in property damage was sustained. Core CRT claims regarding alleged oppression in American society provided much of the impetus for this carnage and for its support by so much of the press, media, major corporations, celebrities, and politicians. CRT is even impacting U.S. foreign policy. Adversaries such as China and Iran leverage CRT claims to diminish American prestige, soft power, and to deflect criticism from their government's humanitarian abuses. As recently discovered by the Biden administration during a humiliating exchange with its Chinese counterparts, it's difficult to stand up to such attacks when your opponents repeat your own administration's anti-American rhetoric back to you. The simple truth is that America is being destroyed from within, and very few of us presently understand what is happening or know how to fight back in an effective manner. We hope to remedy the situation by doing our small part and by encouraging you to do yours. As a nation, we are stronger together. Our national motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. CRT in practice. Consider a recent publication by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture titled Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness and White Culture. In traditional Marxist thinking, capitalist society sustains itself in part by imparting a false consciousness on workers to legitimize the social hierarchy and to reduce the likelihood of revolutionary action. In CRT, where race supplants class, false consciousness takes the form of white culture and internalized whiteness. Drawing on such arguments, the Smithsonian lists the following allegedly harmful aspects of whiteness that everyone, including people of color, wrongly internalize and should reject. Individualism, individual autonomy, and self-reliance. Two-parent homes. Objective, rational, linear thinking. Causality, that is, cause and effect. Math, belief that hard work pays off. Property rights, planning for the future and delaying gratification. Being polite. The Smithsonian is not alone here. In Washington State, the Seattle Public Schools Ethnic Studies Advisory Committee asserts that Western mathematics disenfranchise people and communities of color. Similar sentiments are echoed by academics and even funded by education reformers such as Bill Gates. In Maryland, training for Montgomery County teachers includes identifying the damaging characteristics of white supremacy culture, including individualism, objectivity, only one right way, and worship of the written word. In San Francisco, the vice president of the Board of Education has condemned as racist merit-based selection into advanced academic classes. According to CRT, science, reason, and objectivity are white ways of knowing, whereas black ways of knowing involve storytelling based on lived experiences. Core elements of white ways of knowing are likewise included in the so-called master's tools, institutions that sustain white supremacy, along with such things as the rule of law, due process, civility, keeping to a schedule, etc. If one sought to sabotage the life prospects of a young person of color, the most vulnerable target of CRT ideas, teaching him or her to reject reason, responsibility, diligence, civility, and the like would do the trick. Credible research demonstrates that the surest path to success in American society is for young people to do precisely the opposite. This is particularly true for people of more moderate means. CRT's claims are not merely absurd and dangerous, they are racist. By treating rationality, self-restraint, hard work, and responsible time management as the inherent property of whites and not of people of color, CRT attributes adult-like characteristics to whites and childlike characteristics to everyone else. Such arguments should make your average white supremacist blush. Indeed, historically speaking, infantilizing people of color in this way provided a powerful, paternalistic justification for white supremacy. See, for example, the white man's burden. CRT demeans people of color by denying them ownership of and control over their own lives. Worse still, by characterizing ordinary day-to-day interactions as manifestations of racial oppression, CRT traumatizes many of its adherents. It appears to even function as a kind of reverse cognitive behavioral therapy that makes people more fragile, thereby infantilizing them in reality as well as in theory. Hopefully, we have piqued your interest by now. It is important for you to understand more about the concept of critical race theory and where it came from so that you can be armed with the knowledge needed to stand up and confront its opponents. Study questions. Number 1. How would you explain your opposition to CRT to your local school board? Number 2. What is educational equity? Number 3. What would you expect to find in a school curriculum developed to advance cultural competency and learning? Number 4. Can you think of arguments that might be persuasive in organizing stakeholders interested in defending advanced placement courses and the continued use of entrance exams? Chapter 3. Where does critical race theory come from? Cultural Marxism. Make no mistake about it, critical race theory poses an existential threat to the United States. It strikes at the very foundations of American society, undermining American unity and common purpose. As noted in the previous chapter, CRT's corrosive qualities are a feature rather than a bug. CRT is a fundamentally, if not orthodoxically, Marxist ideology. It departs from traditional or economic Marxism by substituting social, especially racial groups, for economic groups. However, it retains the larger, Marx-inspired understanding of society as characterized by group power and oppression. It also retains the revolutionary orientation toward politics that logically follows from viewing society in this light. The origin of this cultural Marxist approach can be traced to the writings of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci bemoaned communism's slow advance in the West, a sentiment that would be shared by many communists to come. Whereas Marx had emphasized the role of material conditions in creating a revolutionary consciousness among workers, Gramsci argued that this process was impeded by the dominance of certain ideas over others, cultural hegemony. From this revised footing, Gramsci proposed that capitalism could be overthrown gradually by infiltrating and transforming society's major institutions. For example, education establishments, media, law, religion, and the family. Under new management, the institutions would transmit revolutionary ideas in place of bourgeois ones. As these ideas came to define common sense in the public imagination, the old, and therefore economic order, would decay and give way to a new, revolutionary, communist society. The dark brilliance of weaponizing society's institutions against society itself is that defending society from this attack becomes an act of social deviance. To critique the dominant counterculture's assault on gender, sexuality, marriage, and the family is bigotry, variously defined. To support Christianity, traditional family and sexual norms, and the rule of law is to support institutions of cultural oppression and domination. Indeed, in a culture so profoundly committed to self-immolation, support for the nation itself, for example, statues of presidents and the American flag, is labeled as divisive and racist. Critical theory. Gramsci's banner was carried to America by the Frankfurt School, a group of Marxists and Freudian academics who fled Hitler's Germany in the 1930s. Much as Gramsci had recommended, Frankfurt scholars worked to undermine capitalist society's foundations by attacking, problematizing its social-cultural foundations. Their approach has been alternatively described as neo-Marxist and as cultural Marxist, although some consider the latter term to be controversial. Frankfurt scholars christened their approach critical theory as a nod to Marx's call for ruthless criticism of all that exists. The term critical theory has both broad and narrow meanings depending on whether the discussion is about philosophy or the history of the social sciences. Max Horkheimer differentiates a critical theory from a traditional theory, stating that where the latter attempts to describe the world as it is and to understand how it works, the former begins with a, quote, normative moral vision for society, describes how the item being critiqued fails that vision, usually in a systemic sense, and prescribes activism to subvert, dismantle, disrupt, overthrow, or change it. That is generally to break and then remake society in accordance with the particular critical theory's prescribed vision, end quote. Using this approach, Frankfurt scholars targeted marriage, the family, and Christianity. In Eris and Civilization, 1955, for example, Herbert Marcuse advocates abandoning traditional morality and embracing sexual revolution and gay rights movements. Marcuse was also instrumental in identifying women and racial and sexual minorities as alternative sources of support for revolutionary change. Recentering the oppressor-oppressed paradigm on so-called victim groups resolved a problem that had long bedeviled the far left, the fact that, in the most advanced capitalist country, workers showed little enthusiasm for revolution. Modern identity politics thus owes much to Marcuse's work. Likewise, his argument for restricting conservative speech in A Critique of Pure Tolerance, 1969, laid the foundation for political correctness and for the censorship that increasingly pervades American public life. Postmodernism. Postmodernism is a theory that radically revises modern assumptions about culture, identity, history, or language. Alongside the Frankfurt School, postmodernism would make key contributions to CRT. Postmodernism emerged during the late 1960s in an environment of destabilizing technological and social change. Postmodern scholars responded to the various crises of modernity. For example, modern war, decolonialization, civil rights struggles, and changing gender and sexual norms by rejecting modernity itself. As described by Jean-François Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition, 1979, postmodernism fundamentally rejects meta-narratives or wide-ranging and cohesive explanations for large phenomena. Science, reason, individualism, and objective standards of value, indeed, objective reality itself, are dismissed by postmodernists as components of an oppressive, bourgeois, and male-dominated Western ideology. By embracing relativism and rejecting objective reality, and with it, the possibility of obtaining true knowledge, postmodernism insulates itself from criticism and obscures its logical inconsistencies. The theory's most glaring inconsistency is its simultaneous rejection of meta-narratives on the one hand and its embrace of a Marxist meta-narrative concerning power, oppression, and the imperative of revolutionary change on the other. At the same time, postmodernist scholars reject orthodox Marxism, scientific socialism, as yet another child of modernity. Indeed, communism's abject and bloody failures were among the crises of modernity that postmodernism emerged to address. In that struggle against the modern, rational world, postmodernists explore the role played by language as an instrument of social power. Like Frankfurt scholars, they approach that task as activists, seeking out and inverting power narratives. Michel Foucault, for instance, claims that all knowledge is produced through discourse or speech promoting a particular worldview. Discourse, in turn, embodies the power interests of society's dominant groups. So understood, it is impossible for knowledge, power knowledge, to be value neutral. Jacques Derrida asserts that language has no objective meaning and that any interpretation of text or speech is equally valid. He further argues that meaning is inherently constructed in terms of opposing positive and negative qualities. For example, white and male are good, while black and female are bad. Consequently, to Derrida, when engaging in an exchange of ideas, quote, "We're not dealing with the peaceful coexistence of a vis-a-vis, but rather with a violent hierarchy. One of the two terms governs the other, axiologically, logically, etc., or has the upper hand. To deconstruct the opposition, first of all, is to overturn the hierarchy at a given moment," end quote. Postmodernism's influence on CRT manifests in claims that speech is violence, including microaggressions and cancel culture, and in claims that science, reason, and objectivity are white ways of knowing. It is evident as well in demands to decolonize various fields of studies and in the creation of absurdities such as ethno-mathematics. In Cynical Theories, 2020, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay argue that before postmodernism could successfully impact the larger culture, it first had to resolve its tendency to deconstruct itself into oblivion. After all, if nothing is real and true knowledge is impossible to obtain, why bother with any of it? The solution offered by Kimberly Crenshaw was that, if nothing else, structures of racial and gender oppression and their intersection were real. Postmodern deconstruction techniques were weaponized on this conceptual footing, first by critical legal studies, theory, and then by critical race theory. These same techniques would also shape gender, queer, and the various ethnic, including whiteness, studies fields. Critical legal and race theories. CRT's most immediate predecessor is critical legal studies theory, CLS, a movement that emerged in the late 1970s in response to a perception among activists that progress towards racial equality had stalled. CLS claims that law creates, quote, illegitimate social hierarchies producing domination of women by men, non-whites by whites, and the poor by the wealthy. They claim that apparently neutral language and institutions operated through law mass relationships of power and control. The emphasis on individualism within the law similarly hides patterns of power relationships while making it more difficult to summon up a sense of community and human interconnection, end quote. CLS uses the law to attack society, hierarchical structures, going after such things as procedural equality, market freedom, property rights, and indeed rights per se, consistent with its opposition to individualism. CLS is, in effect, critical theory as applied to law, drawing heavily on postmodernist interpretation and deconstruction techniques to dismantle the law itself. As the child of CLS, CRT inherits the same approach while also drawing on radical feminism, for example, social constructivism, and whiteness studies, for example, privilege theory and white fragility. Arriving family, at CRT, we encounter the most expressively political and least intellectual branch of the cultural Marxist family tree. CRT's crude pragmatism sometimes obscures its philosophical roots. Consider, for example, the use of storytelling to create counter-narratives to facts and evidence, or consider demands for censorship of political speech. Neither position is particularly highbrow, yet recall that postmodernists reason their way to rejecting reason along with science and evidence as components of white, male, bourgeois oppression. Likewise, regarding censorship, recall Derrida's claim that speech creates power-based binaries, privileging some categories over others. Along similar lines, when one encounters from CRT seemingly absurd and irrational claims, for example, that colorblindness and meritocracy are racist, or that desegregation did little to help American blacks, or transparently harmful advice such as encouraging minorities to reject hard work and timeliness, internalize whiteness, recall that the purpose of a critical theory, per Horkheimer, is to break society and then to remake it along different lines. CRT advocates are acting in accordance with that purpose. Their ideas don't have to make sense to be dangerous. Lastly, given that this chapter traces CRT's intellectual traditions, we feel that it bears emphasizing that all of these ambient traditions are antithetical and diametrically opposed to the ideas and values that form the American tradition. We explore this conflict in greater detail in the next two chapters. Study questions. Question 1. What is cultural Marxism and how did it become a factor in American society? Number 2. How does cultural Marxism differ from economic Marxism? Number 3. Name the major theorists who helped develop cultural Marxism. Number 4. What connection does critical legal studies have to critical race theory? Chapter 4. Critical Race Theory and Traditional American Values. Un-American Values. CRT shocks the sensibilities of many Americans, especially those who hold to traditional American values and principles. CRT proponents bully, shame, and intimidate K-12 school children no less than adults forced into diversity and cultural sensitivity training. Such practices continue despite research confirming the harmful effects of shaming and bullying children in classrooms and in other contexts. If this harassment was targeted towards members of designated racial or ethnic minority groups, it would be roundly condemned. Racial double standards should never be accepted, yet it often seems that double standards are the only standards. For example, in cases of violence and other aggression against whites and often Asians. Consider the dozen or so lawsuits recently filed against CRT enforcing schools and businesses. In one case, white employees were instructed to step back and yield to colleagues of color, as well as to view their own culture as inherently supremacist. In Illinois, 7th and 8th grade students were told to remain silent and to lower their eyes, a gesture of submission while being addressed by their CRT instructor. In New York City, white employees were told by their instructors that their racial identity is toxicity in the air. In Nevada, a 12th grader was required to announce and degrade aspects of his identity, including his Christian faith. There is a name we commonly use to describe bullying and shaming people in this manner. We call such behavior un-American. To describe something as un-American is to say that it is antithetical to some important aspect of American traditions and values. Labeling something as un-American can be controversial. Remember the House Un-American Activities Committee? But as a logical matter, if American nationhood and identity derive principally from certain ideas and practices, antithetical ideas and practices are un-American by definition. Take, for example, President Biden's use of the label un-American to condemn anti-Semitic harassment and to condemn assaults on Asian Americans. In this regard, the president is absolutely correct. Any such mistreatment of our fellow citizens on account of immutable characteristics, for example, race or beliefs, including religion, is a violation of our common understanding of who we are as a people. Harassment, discrimination, intimidation, and general intolerance directed towards whites, Christians, men, and other groups deemed oppressors by their attackers likewise fit this bill. It doesn't matter what the perpetrators of such abuse call themselves or how they rationalize their abuse. Their behavior is indefensible. Accordingly, in his executive memorandum banning CRT training in executive departments and agencies, President Trump condemned CRT as un-American and as anti-American, an even harsher charge. Given the examples referenced here, the former president is on firm ground where CRT in practice is concerned. But what about CRT in theory? Are CRT's proponents in our nation's schools and workplaces simply applying their doctrine in a ham-fisted way, or is there something fundamentally un-American about the doctrine itself from which the abusive nature of its practical application derives? We address this question here and in the next chapter by exploring the values and principles that establish the American tradition and by evaluating the compatibility of CRT with that tradition. We begin with America's secular traditions and then consider America's religious traditions in Chapter 5. Classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is a philosophy that promotes protecting civil liberties and limiting the role of government. It is fundamental to American democracy. CRT, however, strongly rejects this tradition. In this way, critical race theory is anti-American in the same way that the sky is blue and water is wet. To their credit, CRT advocates do little to hide this. In their introduction, Delgado and Stefanczyk write, quote, "Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law." They state further that CRT proponents are suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights, and that classical liberalism is overly caught up in the search for universals. By the liberal order, classical liberalism, and of course, rights, Delgado and Stefanchik referred to the principles underlying the American system, those enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. These include equality under law, equality theory, and individual rights naturally belonging to all people, universals, as informed by a rational Enlightenment understanding of the world and by Republican traditions of self-government. Rejecting this tradition, opposition to freedom, for example, speech and property rights, individualism, meritocracy, the rule of law, impartial justice, and even equality are consistent themes in CRT scholarship and advocacy. Proposals for mass property, confiscation, and race-based redistribution, and for a federal Department of Anti-Racism superseding all laws and government action, that is, democracy, illustrate the tyrannical and even totalitarian tendencies that befit a movement descended from Marxism. At this point, we return to our previous observations regarding abusive practices inflicted in the name of anti-racism. The standard for understanding such practices as un-American is clearly established by the principles encoded in America's founding documents and by the classical liberal tradition that animates them. CRT conflicts with that standard in theory as well as in application in workforce training and in K-12 instruction. Stated differently, CRT is a fundamentally anti-American doctrine that informs and animates un-American behavior. Allegations of white supremacy. We once knew what a white supremacist was. It was a white person who believed that membership in the Caucasian race made him or her genetically and morally superior to members of other racial and ethnic groups. This was the understanding in 2002 when my book, The New White Nationalism in America, was published. In that book, I warned about identity politics and multiculturalism movements that encouraged racial identification among Americans of color. At the time, I was not familiar enough with CRT to make connections that seem obvious now. It was clear, however, that no good thing would come from identity politics. What I called for was an embrace of the American national identity where we would put the interests of the whole nation above our perceived group interests. Fast forward to today. CRT has redefined the concept of white supremacy and given it an entirely new meaning, encompassing nearly all white people. Now, being born into the white race automatically makes one a supremacist unless one is explicitly anti-white. Indeed, CRT is a total rejection of America's liberal tradition in terms of how we ought to treat each other as morally equal and autonomous individuals in possession of natural rights. On this basis, CRT levels false allegations against our nation, and so we think it is important for us to directly address the claim that the United States, and therefore American identity, is somehow rooted in white supremacy. This claim is plainly anti-American and false. To begin, when thinking of national identity, it is helpful to separately consider its ethnic and civic components. The ethnic sources of national identity refer to a shared heritage and include such things as a common language, faith, and ancestry. Civic sources refer to common institutions and values. America's diversity and relative youth, 245 years, limit the ethnic contribution to national identity. Americans do share a common culture, language, customs, and traditions, including those derived from a widely shared Judeo-Christian religious inheritance. In this regard, the influence of America's old stock, Anglo-Saxons, looms large. But contributions from other groups, including people of color, are also unmistakable. To take just one example, consider the outsized role played by Black Americans in shaping the nation's music. For example, blues, jazz, rock and roll, and hip-hop, culture, sports, and vernacular. Without question, American national identity is primarily understood along civic lines. As described by Abraham Lincoln, the United States was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. America's creedal identity creates a foundation for Americanness in the principles of liberty, individualism, equality, and popular government, rather than a shared ethnic or racial heritage. These are universal principles applicable to all men and all times. Such an understanding of what it means to be American is plainly at odds with racial supremacism. A white supremacist opposes natural equality in principle and opposes liberty, popular government, and individualism in practice by denying fundamental rights and liberties to his or her fellow citizens. Racial oppression under slavery and Jim Crow contradicted the nation's founding principles and so strained its identity. Racial oppression today is likewise un-American. Far from a fig leaf for white supremacy, American values are the reason why true systemic racism, slavery, and Jim Crow was ultimately unsustainable in the United States. Frederick Douglass understood this fact. Indeed, he weaponized the contradiction between American values and chattel slavery by calling whites to task for failing to live up to their nation's founding and purpose. Martin Luther King Jr. did the same while also emphasizing the contradiction between racial oppression and America's Judeo-Christian inheritance. The great moral crusades for abolition and civil rights were waged on behalf of American principles. CRT inspired efforts such as the New York Times 1619 Project distort American history by treating aberrations from founding principles as founding principles themselves. Such efforts are, moreover, riddled with factual errors, including the preposterous claim that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery, disregarding the New York Times' own fact-checker, egregious misrepresentation of Abraham Lincoln's views on equality, and crediting slavery for American prosperity when slavery almost certainly stalled economic development in the South. The 1619 Project absurdly attributes nearly every real and supposed evil in American society to the institution of slavery, from capitalist excesses to the absence of single-payer health care and even traffic jams. Moreover, even the date itself is wrong. The first Africans brought to America in 1619 were not slaves, but rather indentured servants. After fulfilling their contracts, some of these previously indentured servants, all blacks themselves, contracted black and white indentured servants of their own. This isn't to diminish the history of racial oppression in the United States. Acknowledging that history is important, but it is likewise important to understand the larger context. Consider, for example, that slavery predated America's founding by literally all of human history. Slavery was largely stamped out by the United States and Great Britain. In so doing, the U.S. and Britain acted at great cost and in accordance with their own universalistic, individualistic values, the same values loathed by CRT. In times, for example, antiquity, and places, for example, the Middle East, lacking such values, slavery was nearly ubiquitous. The tragedy of CRT's spread throughout the American body politic is that Americans are now losing sight of their country's true history and of the remarkable racial progress it has made. A recent study by Eric Kaufman finds that exposure to news and social media, where CRT themes are legion, promotes exaggerated perceptions of racism. Kaufman additionally finds that CRT discourse demoralizes Blacks by reducing self-perceptions of agency. Other research shows that exposing right-leaning whites to CRT themes increases ethnocentrism and in-group identification, the predicates for white nationalism. Just as America's triumphs are a testament to one set of ideas, its present difficulties are a testament to another. In the United States of America, citizens enjoy equality under law, protections of individual rights, and opportunities for success that continue to inspire envy from people around the world. In this context, we think that CRT-led efforts to label the United States a white supremacist country should be viewed as a kind of modern blood libel. We do not say this lightly. The blood libel reference historically refers to grotesque accusations leveled against Jewish people by anti-Semites. Such accusations were unfounded, obscene, and used as a predicate for attacks against an entire group of people. Contemporary attacks on American identity are and do the same. We have made references to Christianity in light of CRT's attacks on Christians. In the next chapter, we examine America's Christian heritage and why Christians often find themselves in the crosshairs of CRT's proponents. Study questions. Question 1. What un-American tactics do CRT proponents use to spread their message? Number 2. What is classical liberalism and how does CRT reject it? Number 3. What is the American identity according to CRT advocates? Number 4. Is CRT opposed to American values in theory, in practice, or in both theory and practice? Chapter 5. Critical Race Theory and America's Christian Inheritance. Christianity in the American Creed. Politics is famously downstream from culture. A lesser-known but important dictum is that culture is downstream from the cult or from religion in the original Latin. Any serious discussion of American values and traditions must therefore address the role of Christianity in the American creed. In doing so, our intention is emphatically not to suggest that non-Christian Americans are, in any sense, less authentically American. We aim, rather, to more fully account for the context in which American values and principles developed. Much like America's ostensibly secular, liberal political inheritance, we find Christianity to be plainly incompatible with critical race theory. However, understanding why this is the case requires some unpacking. Christianity has shaped the United States in at least 4 important respects. The first and most obvious is the direct influence of Christianity and of its antecedent, Judaism, on American culture through the faith traditions of the American people. Settlers of the American colonies were almost exclusively Christian, and influential settler groups, for example, the Puritans and Quakers, were devoutly so. Consequently, Christianity helped shape the nation's laws, holidays, and customs. Prominent institutions, for example, universities, were founded with the aim of teaching faith and promoting Christian understandings of public virtue. Christian imagery is prominently displayed on public buildings. Government proceedings begin with public prayers and so forth. Christianity's direct role in American public life is also expressed in the nation's covenantal tradition. Covenants are enduring agreements between parties meant to be stronger than contracts. For example, God's covenant with the Israelites, consistent with their descriptions of America as a new Israel. Many of America's founders held covenantal views of the United States. Such views, in turn, inform the second distinct source of Christian influence in America, the civil religion. As described by Robert Bellah, the civil religion is the United States' institutionalized national public faith, which is distinct from the private religions of the American people. The civil religion is a kind of Christianity light that draws from the nation's Judeo-Christian faith traditions and from Christianity's influence on the American founding. More on this to follow. To frame the nation's purpose in biblical terms, examples include presidential addresses evoking God, public policy advocacy, for example, voting rights reform, framed in terms of carrying out God's will, the consecration of American history with biblical analogies, for example, independence as Exodus and Lincoln's death as martyrdom, for the nation's sin of slavery as akin to Jesus' death for the sins of mankind. Third, America's decentralized and limited system of government reflects the framers' view, perhaps excluding Jefferson, that religion would supplement state power in preserving social order, as stated by Washington in his farewell address. Quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. And let us, with caution, indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." End quote. Putting the matter more succinctly, John Adams said, quote, "Our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." End quote. Self-government, in other words, presupposes a self-governing citizenry. Averting anarchy requires some restraints over individuals' more pathological inclinations, excessive ambition, greed, cruelty, lust, retribution, etc. Limited government means that control must also exist apart from the state, in strong communities, in families, and within citizens themselves. Given that, at the time, nearly every American was a Christian, it is safe to assume that Washington and Adams meant Christianity when referring to religion. Many today would balk at this understanding. However, as recorded by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, 1835, American society flourished under this arrangement. Some, perhaps, channeling President Eisenhower, might amend the framers' view to say that any religious belief can carry the weight of private and public morality in a free society. Fourth, Christianity not only provided the guardrails against the liberal political tradition, it also shaped the development of that tradition. Consider that, as noted by Bella, 1967, the Declaration of Independence, the heart of the nation's purpose and creed, references God in four distinct ways. First, as the designer of the universe and source of natural law. Second, as the source of humanity's inalienable rights contra absolutism. Third, as the supreme judge of the world. And fourth, as the source of divine providence. The Declaration was hardly the exception to some general secular rule. Christianity exerted a profound influence on political thought in late 18th century America. Indeed, a survey of more than 15,000 political pamphlets, articles, and books of that era finds that America's founding fathers referred to the Bible more often than they referred to all Enlightenment thinkers combined. Americans had also been practicing democracy in varying degrees for centuries by this point, and Protestantism's influence on democratic participation appears to have been substantial. The West's secular liberal inheritance also owes much to its Christian religious inheritance. As a movement away from superstition and toward science and materialism, the Enlightenment is typically framed in opposition to Christianity. There are problems with this account, however, including the fact that the intellectual and private commitments of many Enlightenment thinkers were often deeply Christian. More fundamentally, it is difficult to imagine how one arrives at liberalism, or for that matter, a notion of a rationally ordered and discernible universe without a firm grounding in natural law. Natural law is deeply woven into the Christian faith. It is dogma in Catholicism, for example. Describing natural law in Summa Theologia 1485, St. Thomas Aquinas writes, quote, "The light of reason is praised by nature and thus by God, in every man to guide him in his acts," end quote. Through reason, people discern the truth about God's creation. The Christian tradition places natural law above positive or man-made law, enabling earthly leaders to be held to account. Natural law laid the groundwork for rejecting absolutism, for asserting claims of immutable rights, and for proposing contractual theories of government. So while Thomas Jefferson drew heavily on John Locke's second treatise, 1689, in the Declaration's preface, both men's writings testified to Christianity's influence on the classical liberal mind. Political theorists Ofer Haveri and Yoram Hazony go further, arguing that much of what we commonly credit to the Enlightenment and to liberalism should be credited instead to a distinct, but also biblically rooted, pre-liberal English conservative tradition. In The Virtue of Nationalism, 2018, Hazony additionally credits the Protestant construction of the West, as manifested in the Peace of Westphalia for institutionalizing protections for individual rights and national self-determination. Taken together, the influence of Christian thinking on classically liberal and conservative values is profound. Given the institutionalization of these values in the United States, CRT's hostility to the American creed is likewise aimed at America's Christian religious inheritance. The churches of woke. This is not to say that critical race theory is only indirectly opposed to Christianity. Consider, for example, the distinction drawn by Ibram X. Kendi between, in his words, liberation and savior theologies. Kendi describes the former as a commitment to radical social activism as informed by a vision of Jesus Christ as a political revolutionary struggling against oppression. He describes the latter as one where individual sinners are saved through their faith in Jesus Christ. Christian and non-Christian readers alike will recognize Christianity in savior theology. Kendi goes on to assert that anti-racist CRT advocates must reject savior theology, Christianity, traditionally understood because it, quote, goes right in line with racist ideals and racist theology in which they say, you know what, Black people, other racial groups. The reason why they're struggling on earth is because what they are behaviorally doing wrong. And it is my job as the pastor to sort of save these wayward Black people or wayward poor people or wayward queer people. That kind of theology breeds bigotry, end quote. Kendi's claims here are consistent with his earlier reference claims regarding the meaning of racial disparities. Sin is to be found in oppressive power structures, not individual people. It certainly doesn't reside in the victims of oppression. The following attempts to catalog the conflicts between Christianity and CRT, borrowing heavily from Christian apologetics blogger Neil Shenvi. Given the deep incongruity of these two meta-narratives, this list is almost certainly not comprehensive. Number 1, hegemonic narratives. First, and most obviously, CRT derives from atheist thinkers who viewed Christianity as an instrument of capitalist and racist, sexist, heteronormative, cisgender, etc. oppression. Second, a consistent theme in CRT is its distrust of authoritative claims, particularly those perceived as deriving from dominant groups. We thus encounter claims that math is racist and science is a white way of knowing. As Shenvi amusingly puts it, quote, unfortunately, the Bible is nothing but one giant, colossal, hegemonic discourse from start to finish. That means there is one true story of religion, one true story of morality, one true story of sexuality, one true story of gender, and so forth. It can be added that the truth or falsehood of biblical narratives is not contingent on one's lived experiences. Number 2, the problem of sin versus the problem of oppression. In the biblical view, free will creates the possibility, inevitability, of disobedience to God's will. The problem of sin resides in the heart of every person individually. The obligation to stop sinning and to seek redemption through faith is, likewise, an individual one. In the CRT view, society is comprised of groups arrayed in unequal power relationships. The problem of the world is oppression, specifically oppression of groups by groups. As such, individual agency is radically de-emphasized. Number 3, fundamental enmity or Christian equality. As noted, CRT is surprisingly opposed to equality. This follows from its division of society into mutually antagonistic groups. In the Christian worldview, by contrast, quote, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are one in Christ Jesus, end quote, Galatians 3:28. People are not natural enemies, but rather brothers and sisters in Christ, each being made in God's image and each being guilty of sin and in need of salvation. Of course, theory is one thing and practice is another. Your experience may differ, as the saying goes, but beginning in different places, it shouldn't be surprising when Christians and Marxists arrive at different destinations. Number 4, moral universalism versus moral asymmetry. A corollary to the previous point is that, as a group power meta-narrative that rejects objective hegemonic standards of value, CRT jettisons individual and universal ethics for relativism. This puts CRT at odds with both Christianity and liberalism, natural law. CRT relies on extraordinary and conspiratorial rationalizations of unequal treatment in theory, but there's no denying its demand for unequal treatment in practice. For example, speech and behavior are either excused and praised or condemned depending on the group interests they allegedly advance. This asymmetry extends to this moral realm where members of oppressor and oppressed groups are assigned different obligations and are judged according to different criteria. Some people are obligated to publicly grovel for sins they never committed, for example, slavery, and renounce their supposed privileges. Other people are condescendingly excused from responsibility for even their own actions, let alone those of other group members. Number 5, separate kingdoms. Even Christianity's most committed critics readily acknowledge the importance of Jesus' injunction to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Like the Constitution's separate powers, separate kingdoms are essential to liberty. The separation of political and religious authority, codified in the First Amendment, doesn't banish God's religious expression from the public sphere any more than it banishes Caesar's politics from the private sphere. Rather, it resists the unity of the two authorities, God versus kings, thereby safeguarding a private sphere of life from the possibility of total power in the hands of a single authority. CRT is not concerned with the supernatural, but this is not a limiting principle. Rather, as with other radical perspectives, the personal is political. Religious tests for public office are not permitted in America, nor are they permitted in the private sector, apart from narrow exceptions for explicitly religious organizations. By contrast, public and private sector workers are often forced to attend CRT indoctrination sessions under the guise of workforce diversity training. Likewise, religious instruction is not permitted in public schools, but is embedded in curricula around the country. All must bend the knee in CRT's singular kingdom. Yet even if CRT were to triumph completely, for example, if Americans traded self-government for Kennedy's anti-racist tyranny, would its crusade end there? If America is truly racism and white supremacy all the way down, where does CRT stop? Critical race theory is functionally speaking, a new religion. This observation was prominently made in 2015 by John McWhorter, noting that anti-racism, in his phrasing, contains the core elements of religion, including faith, suspension of disbelief, a creed, a clergy, rituals, proselytizing, judgment, redemption, and even original sin. The last three elements are noteworthy in that they are not merely religious, but are specifically Christian in character. This point is powerfully developed by Joshua Mitchell in American Awakening, 2020. Mitchell attributes the ascendance of identity politics to the decline of mainland Protestantism. The new faith borrows from the old, from Protestantism specifically, notions of transgression and innocence, but unfortunately not forgiveness, charity, or humility. It thus constructs a, quote, ghastly and unworkable manifestation of Christianity, end quote, where sinner groups are redeemed and where saint groups are confined to a permanent state of impotent rage. Returning to Bella's analysis, it could be argued that CRT is not a new religion, but is actually two new religions, one public replacement for America's civil religion and one private woke church expressed in various denominations through CRT's colonization and subversion of Christianity proper. Examples of the former abound in the Biden administration, where America is condemned as systemically racist, with the kind of zeal displayed by former administrations in praising America as a shining city on the hill. Consider, for example, Press Secretary Jen Psaki's remarkable public confession of faith, suspension of disbelief, in McWhorter's terms, evoking systemic racism to condemn a police officer for acting to save the life of a black teenager by shooting the person who was trying to stab her to death with a knife. The assailant was also black. CRT has given us a new national story of America's founding and purpose, and our institutions are dutifully expounding that story. Monuments to the greatness of American history are thus coming down. In terms of Christianity itself, the creeping influence of CRT on doctrine is unmistakable. In evangelical Christianity, this woke church holds that whites carry a special inherited sin as descendants of slave owners and beneficiaries of systemic racism. Whites must therefore seek earthly redemption by tearing down systems of oppression and by giving money to black people in reparations. Catholicism is no less affected, and as argued by Joseph Bottom in An Anxious Age, 2014, mainline Protestantism has led the way. The church should be leading the fight against CRT. In Acts 17:26, Luke reminds fellow believers that, quote, from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands, end quote. In Countercultural Living, I wrote, quote, as a worldview, critical theory, along with all of its different offshoots like critical race theory, is at odds with the biblical message of Jesus Christ's finished work on the cross. Christians believe that human beings are created in God's divine image and that we are all sinners in need of the redeeming power of Jesus' shed blood on the cross. The critical theory worldview speaks of oppressive, dominant groups and marginalized minority groups needing liberation. Such deliverance, according to critical theory, can only be granted by the dominant groups who are expected to divest themselves of their privilege, power, and wealth. In these narratives, ethnic and racial minorities fall into the category of the oppressed. Whites in Western civilization, in particular, fall into the category of oppressors who must continually make amends for societal racism, end quote. CRT preaches a different gospel. It should not be leading and guiding the work of the church. The church needs to lead in this area. We hope that this chapter has helped you understand CRT's anti-biblical narrative and the harm it is wreaking on Christianity and its witness to the world. Study questions. Question 1. How has Christianity shaped the United States? Number 2. What are the conflicts between Christianity and critical race theory? Number 3. Why is CRT essentially a new religion? Number 4. Why should the church be a key player in the fight against CRT? Chapter 6. Critical Race Theory, the U.S. Constitution, and Civil Rights Law. CRT versus Civil Rights. In critical race theory, we find a movement willing to trample rights, liberties, and national solidarity in pursuit of equity, equal outcomes, and distributions of goods by group. To recap, CRT proponents object to the First Amendment's elevation of free speech above the freedom to be free from the victimization, stigma, and humiliation that free speech entails. The concern here is not hateful speech per se, but specifically speech targeting members of, quote, oppressed groups. CRT likewise opposes equality, mere non-discrimination, and individual rights as impediments to remedies for group imbalances, for example, confiscating property from whites and giving it to blacks. In terms of justice, CRT rejects the idea that laws should apply equally to everyone, legal neutrality, and instead embraces an individualized justice that again attempts to remedy group disparities. Finally, CRT puts democracy in the crosshairs. After all, why should we let inequitable policies stand just because the majority chose them? CRT's opposition to liberties, rights, and to the rule of law is in obvious tension with the civil rights movement, which fought to secure civil rights and equality under the law for people of color. Its attacks on civil rights deprives people of color of their inheritance no less than whites. However, proponents like Derek Bell argue that abstractions and legal remedies do little to advance minority interests or well-being. Laws, in this view, simply encode their author's dominant group's interests. Bell's racial realism consequently embraces and ends justify the means approach to legal reasoning, substituting the rule of law with the rule of men. CRT proponents should consider whether this approach is likely to benefit racial minorities in the long run. In a democracy where majority rule is restrained by structures such as rights, equality, and legal neutrality. CRT's radicalism speaks to its despair regarding the legacy of the civil rights movement. As noted in Chapter 3, Critical Legal Studies, CLS, was formed in response to perceptions that civil rights gains were eroding. CLS and consequently CRT pinpointed the problem on the American political system, society, and values, a framework within which the civil rights movement was also embedded. As stated by Kimberly Crenshaw, quote, liberals and conservatives seem to see issues of race and law from within the same structure of analysis, namely, a policy that legal rationality could identify and eradicate the biases of racial consciousness in social decision-making. A line of continuity thus links the colorblind ideal at the heart of debates over affirmative action to MLK's I Have a Dream speech, and from there to Justice John Marshall Harlan's dissent to the doctrine of separate but equal in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. As argued in Chapter 4, that line ultimately traces back to the American founding. CRT versus the Constitution and Civil Rights Law. The conflict between CRT and civil rights and liberties is presently playing out in the judicial system. Under CRT, instruction in schools and workplaces, whites, including young children, are berated by instructors and required to confess culpability for racial oppression. Those who fail to do so, or who protest their innocence, are further condemned for manifesting, quote, white fragility, additional complicity in racism. Disagreeing with CRT claims of systemic racism and white supremacy likewise exposes students and employees to public scolding and retribution. Such practices raise important constitutional and legal concerns. Compelling speech rather obviously violates free speech protections under the First Amendment. Punishing employees and students for noncompliance with unconstitutional requirements, in turn, violates 14th Amendment due process protections. Singling out racial and other groups for hostile treatment seems to plainly violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and under Title VI and IX of the 1972 educational amendments to that act, which extends these prohibitions to institutions receiving federal funding, for example, schools. In response to these apparent civil rights violations, a network of conservative organizations and attorneys is backing a series of lawsuits that seeks to abolish CRT indoctrination in the federal government and in the nation's schools and workplaces. Among them, a Nevada lawsuit alleges that a high school student was required to announce aspects of his identity and then to denigrate those identity markers using terms such as privilege and oppressor. Refusing to do so, he was given a failing grade. Another lawsuit alleges that New York City's Department of Education sidelined, and punished plaintiffs and other Caucasian female DOE employees on the basis of their race, gender, and unwillingness to accept their other colleagues' hateful stereotypes about them. In California, a lawsuit against the Department of Fish and Wildlife claims that employees were compelled to affirm CRT claims regarding whites' inherent racism. Disingenuous defenses. At the time of this writing, CRT proponents have responded to anti-CRT lawsuits with the following challenges. First, defenders claim that such efforts violate the First Amendment free speech rights of schools and companies, including those of the contractors who run the various diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI workshops. They extend this claim, asserting that CRT's opponents do not believe in the legal merits of their own lawsuits, but are rather cynically attempting to mobilize conservative voters by picking a fight in the cultural war. Second, CRT's proponents argue that efforts to restrict CRT, including President Trump's now revoked executive order, limit the employment opportunities of DEI contractors and threaten the DEI business model. Third, they argue that restriction bills employ vague wording. Finally, as one might expect, CRT proponents argue that anti-CRT efforts are motivated by racism. A New Hampshire bill, HB 544, which limits workplace CRT instruction, was labeled the White Supremacy Protection Act by its opponents. Regarding the claims of CRT defenders, the latter three do not merit extended consideration here. The wording of specific bills is a technical question. Allegations of racism are par for the course when challenging CRT. Finally, regarding the viability of the DEI business model, if a given firm's services are no longer desired, that, as they say, is that. As a legal matter, the First Amendment objection is at least potentially serious, even if CRT proponents are plainly disingenuous. The irony of defending an anti-free speech movement on free speech grounds would be lost on very few. As noted, the CRT case against free speech evokes the emotional distress, victimization, stigma, and humiliation. In Derek Bell's words, people may feel when confronted with ideas with which they disagree. This is, without question, one of the costs of freedom. One can certainly sympathize with those who, from an abundance of empathy, weigh the costs and benefits of free speech differently than the framers. However, in the case of CRT proponents, one finds little evidence of empathy for white people, children included, experiencing emotional distress as a result of being forced to endure racially motivated verbal harassment in institutional settings, institutional racism. Indeed, CRT proponents treat such distress, white fragility, and white tears as a cynical ploy by whites to avoid confronting their complicity in racism. Regarding the legal merits of the First Amendment argument, lawyer and author Hans Bader demonstrates that CRT is on shaky ground. The most obvious problem is that courts have ruled that government entities, such as school boards, do not have First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court has also ruled that states may determine school curricula and that doing so does not raise free speech concerns. Indeed, the court has affirmed that the powers of political subdivisions, for example, school boards, reside in the absolute discretion of the state. Not only can states prohibit CRT instruction in schools, but there is also a strong argument that they must do so. As Bader states, quote, "The 14th Amendment forbids states to create a learning environment that is hostile to students based on their race or sex, such as by repeatedly subjecting a captive audience of students to racist or sexist insults." In this regard, the definition of racism and sexism matters. The CRT understanding by which only whites can be racist is plainly not the position encoded in civil rights law. Rather, whites are afforded equal protection under the law and are therefore protected from racial harassment and discrimination. The First Amendment prohibits compelling speech in school settings, and this presumably protects white students no less than students of color. CRT in the workplace is also legally problematic, though its proponents might have more leeway as there are potentially important distinctions to consider. Inviting a speaker to a conference where attendance is optional is one thing. Requiring attendance at such a conference or contracting with such a speaker to lead employee training sessions is another. given that absent or passive employees will be noticed by managers. Case law seems to suggest that common DEI training practices constitute racial harassment. Take, for example, Sandia National Laboratory's mandatory 3-day re-education camp for white males. White male employees were instructed to expose the roots of white male culture, publicly recite white privilege and male privilege statements, and then to write apology letters to white women, people of color, and other groups. In the Sandia case, an employee was suspended for criticizing this training. Bader argues that such action likely violates anti-retaliation provisions of civil rights laws. This is important because even if DEI instruction of this kind is somehow not racial harassment, mandatory training presupposes punishment for noncompliance. Given that case law protects employees from retaliation in cases where they might reasonably believe that their civil rights have been violated, mandating attendance at such events could prove legally impractical. Much like CRT's legal defense, its ethical defense in the mainstream press outlets appears insincere. These sources roundly describe CRT worksite training and school instruction in euphemistic terms such as racial sensitivity training or racial inequality education. Intentionally or otherwise, such descriptions mask CRT's inherent divisiveness. When describing the ideology itself, prominent news sources appeal to opposition to racism and other nearly universally revered values. An interview in the Washington Post even evoked founding principles as a defense of CRT. The profound irony of such accounts is that such values are nearly universal rather than universal, chiefly due to sustained efforts by CRT advocates and other cultural Marxists to delegitimize them. As argued by Christopher Rufo, if CRT defenders are confident in the force of their ideas, they will defend them, not with platitudes and not only in theory, but specifically and in practice. They will assert, for example, 1, that teachers should instruct third graders to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and to rank themselves according to power and privilege. 2, that principals should tell parents to become, quote, white traitors and to support white abolition. And 3, that companies should instruct white employees to be less white, and so forth. A few prominent proponents are willing to speak plainly in support of CRT. To his credit, Ibram X. Kendi is quite candid in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, when he states, quote, the only remedy to racial discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination, end quote. Of course, the position of U.S. civil rights law is somewhat different. Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act states that, quote, all persons shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, and privileges, advantages, and accommodations of any place of public accommodation, without discrimination or segregation on the ground of race, color, religion, or national origin. In terms of employment, Section 703 of the same Act states that, quote, it should be an unlawful employment practice for an employer, 1, to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. 2, to limit, segregate, or classify his employees in any way which would deprive or tend to deprive any individual of employment opportunities or otherwise adversely affect his status as an employee. Or 3, to fail or refuse to refer for employment or otherwise to discriminate against any individual because of his race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, or to classify or refer for employment any individual on the basis of his race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Finally, the 1972 Education Amendments to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 state that, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, Title VI, or on the basis of sex, Title IX, be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, end quote. Kendi's statement is perhaps illustrative of why many CRT apologists are less forthright in their public statements. The obvious irreconcilability of CRT and civil rights law cannot have escaped the attention of CRT's legal defenders. Likewise, CRT's defenders in the press are likely to understand that an informed American public will not support racism masquerading as anti-racism. Americans who believe in the civil rights tradition and in equality before the law must stand together to resist and topple CRT and the undeserved moral authority it has usurped. In Chapters 7 and 8, we provide strategies and concrete suggestions for fighting back. Study questions. Question 1. How does CRT conflict with the civil rights movement? Number 2. What laws and amendments do CRT practices violate? Number 3. How do CRT proponents respond to anti-CRT claims? Number 4. Why do CRT proponents' responses not withstand scrutiny? Chapter 7. Strategies for Resisting Critical Race Theory's Influence. Surveying the Battlefield. CRT first secured a base of support in American universities and then proceeded to infiltrate the remaining major institutions of American society. As CRT opponents, our objective must be to arrest CRT's momentum and then to drive it out of the real world and back into academic obscurity. In formulating strategies to this effect, we start with a frank assessment of the battlefield, the terrain, actors, and resources, including will. Cultural Marxism's long march through the institutions is nearly complete. CRT now permeates the political and administrative arms of the government, the news media, the academy, entertainment, and the arts. Excepting for political government, which changes hands regularly, these institutions have been, broadly speaking, left-leaning for some time. Here, CRT's advance seems relatively straightforward. The preferences of left-leaning Americans shape left-leaning institutions and vice versa. CRT's presence in the academy and in the media reinforce one another and drive the leftward radicalization of particularly white liberals on racial issues, aka the Great Awakening. This process is further compounded by online echo chambers and by social media. CRT's rapid advance through, broadly speaking, conservative organizations is proceeding along several paths. However, it is worth pausing here to acknowledge how profoundly conservatives underestimated the vulnerability of their institutions. Until recently, the idea of churches, the military, and business cozying up en masse to a movement opposed to Christianity, America, and capitalism seemed unthinkable. If indeed the facts of life are conservative, as Margaret Thatcher assured us, the normal course of things, for example, getting a job, starting a family, should have provided the antidote to campus-style radicalism. In the case of the military, CRT indoctrination is well underway, and the key vulnerability appears to be the institution's exposure to politics. The Biden administration is actively punishing CRT objecting service members, all the while waving the bloody shirt of the Capitol Hill riot to purge the military of so-called extremists. As evidenced by the recent campaign to exclude conservative National Guardsmen from the inauguration. Extremism is the code for Trump support. Indeed, it seems broader than this. Under the leadership of a CRT zealot, the Pentagon's Countering Extremism Working Group is busy creating new categories of extremists. Among the recent additions, patriot extremists are those said to harbor dangerous beliefs, including notions that the U.S. government has become corrupt or has overstepped its constitutional boundaries or is no longer capable of protecting the people against foreign threats. Of course, such beliefs aren't even remotely extreme. Allegations of corruption are commonplace in American politics. Point 2 has been a consensus view among Republicans since the New Deal. A 2019 Gallup poll found that 56% of Americans believe that the government has too much power. Point 3 is similarly mundane. Is no one permitted to question the government's aptitude in combating terrorism or foreign pathogens or drug smuggling by foreign cartels or election interference from Russia, that is? Even more absurd than preventing young patriots from serving their country on such grounds is the notion that CRT has any place in the armed forces to begin with. CRT claims the basis for systemic racism and white supremacy resides in the nation's DNA through the Constitution. American servicemen and women swear oaths of allegiance to the same Constitution and defend the country with their lives. Every one of them is therefore a white supremacist, according to CRT. Such distinct causes are apparent regarding CRT's expansion into churches. The first mirrors the path taken by CRT in left-leaning institutions, that is, through church members. This is because many churches are, in fact, left-leaning institutions. Mainline Protestantism, for example, has been fairly liberal for some time, especially due to the influence of the social gospel. Second, CRT's institutional hegemony establishes its respectability among the right sort of people, those that elites want to be or be seen as being. Institutional leaders, for example, pastors, senior managers, CEOs, might be more susceptible to this kind of values-based status signaling. Third, as noted, Christianity created a moral revolution in terms of how society perceives the dignity and value of the vulnerable and the oppressed. Christianity profoundly shapes the larger cultural environment in which Marxist perspectives find resonance. In this sense, the church is inherently vulnerable to CRT. Of the three besieged conservative institutions, CRT's business foothold, aka woke capital, is the most cynically self-interested. To be sure, the changing preferences of liberal employees and activist HR departments impact business culture in ways exogenous to leadership. At the same time, company leaders are choosing to embrace social justice causes rejected by their own consumers. For example, ESPN. to aggressively push fringe and unpopular policies, example, Delta Airlines, and of course, to belittle their own employees, Coca-Cola. The question is why? More precisely, given that the business of business is making money, why have major American corporations concluded that embracing CRT is profitable? Results from a recent survey experiment published by the Harvard Business Review, HBR, shed light on this question. HBR researchers surveyed attitudes towards a fictitious company. They informed participants that the company was either liberal or conservative in terms of the public causes it supports and in terms of the personal values of its CEO. The conservative company was rated 33% less favorably by participants, and this difference was entirely attributable to negative evaluations by self-identified Democrats. Republicans were not swayed one way or the other by the company's political stance. This asymmetry is visible as well in party politics, where Democrats routinely press business to advance liberal policies, where Republicans defend businesses' right to be unencumbered by politics and by government generally. Conservatives also lag liberals in terms of political contributions and participation, for example, volunteering and protesting. Richard Hanania frames this discrepancy in terms of ordinal and cardinal utility. A voter expresses his or her perceptions of ordinal utility in choosing candidate A over candidate B. The intensity of this preference, this cardinal utility, is irrelevant insofar as each voter votes only once. Outside of elections, however, liberals' dramatic advantage over conservatives in terms of cardinal utility pressures institutions to bend left. The difference between the two groups might be partly dispositional, but ideology is undoubtedly a major factor. The business community has taken note that one side of the political divide gives away the milk for free while the other demands, buy the milk or else, plata o plumo, as Pablo Escobar would say. American industry is constantly repaying the voters who delivered them corporate tax cuts and deregulation with CRT, workforce indoctrination, and public denunciations of systemic racism. There is a valuable lesson to be learned here. The bottom line has no loyalty. A final note on institutions. In 1989, John O'Sullivan observed that institutions drift leftward over time. He included as examples the NAACP and Amnesty International, both of which were formerly associated with prominent conservatives. O'Sullivan speculated that the people who staff institutions generally don't like right-wing things like private profit, business, and the social order, though he suggested that explicitly conservative institutions were immune from this trend. With the benefit of hindsight, it is clear that O'Sullivan's first law was far too modest. Explicitly conservative institutions, for example, Fox News, The Drudge Report, and Christian colleges, as well as private industry, have all shifted markedly left. The cause of leftward institutional drift is somewhat opaque. Kevin Williamson suggests that hiring managers typically hire other people like themselves. This seems reasonable. One can imagine additional factors, among them size. Institutions generally grow over time, and in the case of business, size is accompanied with government entanglement, including opportunities for rent seeking. As Bill Gates might attest, playing ball with the government is often the safest bet. Institutional leftward drift is important, but not because the left and CRT are synonymous. They are not. It is rather that culturally liberal institutions seem to be more susceptible to CRT influence operating through the preferences of liberal managers and workers. Having appraised the lay of the land, we offer the following strategic frames to help CRT opponents develop resistance tactics. Number 1, CRT's institutional dominance means that CRT opponents are insurgents. It is a common refrain for non-radicals, not just conservatives, to speak of themselves in terms like, quote, ordinary people, real America, and the silent majority. CRT opponents might outnumber proponents, but their influence sorely lags their numbers. CRT opponents must therefore adopt an underdog mentality and work hard to enhance the cardinal preferences of their troops. Get people mobilized, in other words. Number 2, most institutions will have to be recaptured because the country cannot do without them. At the same time, war is an economy. In some cases, it will be more effective to degrade and dismantle an institution than to recapture it. Number 3, leftward institutional drift seems to be a kind of natural law, enhancing economic dynamism. Increasing the number of rising and falling companies might help impede the overall leftward drift of economic institutions. Actively breaking up concentrations of economic power, particularly those in the hands of CRT proponents, should be on the table. Number 4, CRT's proponents are clearly committed. Are we? More specifically, are you? Are you willing to match the other side's zeal when it comes to pressuring the institutions? There are limits, of course. We can't oppose free speech rights for CRT advocates, for example, but to foreshadow policy proposals to come, must we reimburse education loans to support racist and anti-American college instruction? Winning this fight will require us to step out of our comfort zones. Number 5, establishment or movement conservatism is now well past its sell-by date. To reiterate, not every CRT opponent is a conservative, more on this below, but conservatives are and will continue to be pivotal in this fight. Reagan-era conservatism coalesced in response to the challenges of a different era. A new fusion is now needed, something likewise tethered to conservative philosophy but adapted for the tasks ahead. Number 6, even so, the conflict with CRT will test conservatism's limits because there are important philosophical tensions to consider. First, going back to Edmund Burke, 1789, conservatism views institutions as key sources of social stability. With the dramatic advance of CRT, the institutions are now key sources of instability. Fighting within and against institutions will be awkward, particularly for conservative intellectuals. Second, the fight against CRT pits the people against the elites, but populism and conservatism are awkward bedfellows. Conservatism understands that society is inherently hierarchical and that opposing elites per se doesn't make sense. Conservatives indeed seek good elites, those who will put the well-being of their country and people first. To the extent that American elites embrace CRT, they reject the country they lead. Even the French aristocracy, for all its faults, wasn't anti-France. Populism and conservatism are therefore united of necessity, but the tension will have to be managed. Joining the battle, voice. With this in mind, we offer a final framework in which to evaluate our CRT-resistant efforts: voice, exit, and guerrilla warfare. In Exit, Voice and Loyalty, 1970, Albert Hirschman proposes that, faced with unsatisfactory circumstances, members of organizations, nations, businesses, etc., have two options. They can attempt to change circumstances by voicing their grievances, or they can exit the organization. We figuratively add guerrilla warfare to this framework, drawing on Rosemary O'Leary's work highlighting efforts by rogue public servants to undermine government agencies from within. Viewed in this light, most current and potential CRT resistance efforts fall under voice. Political scientist David Mayhew, 1974, famously proposed that members of Congress should be viewed as single-minded seekers of re-election. Mayhew's claim is overstated, but insightful. Obtaining re-election is not sufficient for most members of Congress. They have other goals, but it is, without question, necessary. Your federal, state, and local representatives care what you think, or rather, they will care if they are persuaded that their continued employment depends on addressing your concerns. Through the use of voice, several important efforts have been made to counteract CRT's growing influence in America's civic and political life. President Trump's now rescinded executive order was one. Since then, state governments have passed similar restrictions. As discussed in Chapter 6, legal challenges to CRT are underway. Certainly, much ink has been spilled on the subject of CRT in books, news, and a few journal articles, op-eds, and indeed this book. A few prominent voices in the media, including influential liberal voices, are speaking out against CRT as expressed in cancel culture. By far, the most exciting development has been the engagement of the American public. Public mobilization emboldens CRT skeptics in institutions, including the government, and signals to those who are unsure or just indifferent the direction in which the wind is blowing. Mobilization is essential. A note for conservatives: recent events demonstrate that prominent GOP elected officials continue to prioritize donors ahead of voters. Party leaders are signaling that they expect voters to support them regardless of what they do in office. Convince them otherwise through your emails, phone calls, letters to newspaper editors, and support for their primary opponents. One especially powerful way to impact GOP politics is by becoming a precinct committeeman, where you can help to choose party leaders from the inside. A note for liberals: if you're concerned about the onward march of this fundamentally illiberal ideology, don't be shy. Let your legislators, federal, state, and local, friends and colleagues know that they aren't alone. Remind them that freedom of speech, equal treatment under law, and rational inquiry are all liberal values, and that the Constitution is, in many ways, a liberal document. CRT and its associated, quote, woke culture have their prominent left-wing critics and ample grounds for criticism from the left. The American left needs more of these voices, and the country needs a broad-based, bipartisan coalition of the unwoke to defeat the movement. CRT proponents like to claim that silence is complicity or violence. Those of us, left, right, and center, whose worldview is grounded in the American tradition, need not resort to such bullying tactics. Rather, we can simply say that courage is contagious. Letting our voices be heard is not exclusively a matter of politics. All the institutions must be engaged. Companies need to know that consumers won't stand for workplace CRT indoctrination or for CRT-inspired public rhetoric. Let companies like Nike know that they can either promote public figures such as Colin Kaepernick, who condemned the 4th of July as a celebration of white supremacy, or they can have your business. Disney recently learned this lesson the hard way. Ultimately, if voice fails, if the institutions fail to adjust to our expressed concerns, other options are available. Joining the battle, exit. When institutions refuse to budge, we can still influence them simply by leaving. We can think of using exit to undermine hostile, CRT-held institutions by removing our resources from them, our approval, time, money, and our viewership. That is, ad revenues, so also money. We can also think of displacing hostile institutions as an extension of exit. You can, for example, quit Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other censorious tech platforms and join alternative platforms such as CloutHub, Parler, Gab, Rumble, and others. Doing so hits the hostile institutions twice, much as a disaffected voter costs his or her party 2 votes, one from the withdrawal of support and another from handing that support to the opposition. The downside of leaving is that we remove our voices from influencing large public spaces. It is worth thinking carefully about when to abandon mainstream platforms and when to remain. However, there does not seem to be any downside to giving patronage to their competitors. It is also important to emphasize that exit should not be viewed merely as a defensive tactic. The point can be illustrated using Rod Dreyer's Benedict option, 2017. Writing for a conservative Christian audience, Dreyer proposes a strategic withdrawal from mainstream society and culture into intentional communities of countercultural witness, that is, like-minded people living apart from the dominant culture according to their own values. Dreyer is sometimes mischaracterized as advocating something like a retreat to the hills while the city's institutions burn in preparation for a reseeding of civilization in the rubble at some later date. Such an approach to exit would be exclusively defensive, making no attempt to impact the larger world languishing behind the monastery's walls. The obvious problem with this approach is that CRT permits no quarter from its reach. What Dreyer actually advocates is strategic withdrawal coupled with active efforts, offense, to impact the dominant culture from a renewed position of strength. He incorporates the idea of a parallel polis from the Czech anti-communist Václav Benda, roughly an alternative society, network of institutions and culture, cohabitating the same space as the dominant society and drawing in immigrants from that society. As Dreyer states, quote, "The parallel polis is not about building a gated community for Christians, but rather about establishing or reestablishing common practices and common institutions that can reverse the isolation and fragmentation of contemporary society. In this, we hear Brother Ignatius of Norchaz call to have borders, formal lines behind which we live to nurture our faith and culture, but to push outwards infinitely," end quote. Adapting this approach to resisting CRT in our private lives, we can think of homeschooling networks and private schools, including excellent classical schools, as alternative institutions in a parallel, unwoke polis. We can remove ourselves from streaming services that push CRT distortions and other reprehensible content by creating and patronizing alternative streaming platforms. The Daily Wire is leading the way in this regard, venturing into entertainment with such movies as Run, Hide, Fight, and novels like Another Kingdom. Companies can likewise use exit to take a stance against CRT. We describe a powerful method for doing so in the following chapter. However, briefly, companies can replace divisive DEI training regimes with alternative approaches to workforce diversity management that enhance employee cooperation and unity. Recall that such approaches strike not one, but two blows against CRT. Businesses can also help to mitigate thought and speech control imposed by CRT advocates by hiring the victims of cancel culture, as demonstrated by the Daily Wire when it effectively uncanceled actress Gina Carano. Business can also help to cancel the cancelers, as Idaho internet provider Your T1 Wi-Fi demonstrated when it blocked Facebook and Twitter in response to the social media platforms blocking President Trump. Joining the battle, guerrilla warfare. CRT's institutional dominance means that its opponents must learn to think more like insurgents. For inspiration as to what an insurgent mentality looks like in practice, we look back to the original counterculture. In his 1971 Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky encourages revolutionaries to infiltrate mainstream institutions while keeping their views hidden. Only once in positions of power should their aims become evident. Clearly, someone was paying attention. Such an approach is plainly neither voice nor exit. As noted, we propose these three frames for readers to consider on a case-by-case basis. Presumably, quitting your job, exit, over your company's CRT posture is not feasible. You might also want to avoid voicing your objections to CRT during the hiring process. This isn't infiltration so much as common sense, but the point here is to act effectively as circumstances allow. In this context, guerrilla warfare, our broad catch-all category for irregular tactics, is a third method we can use to resist CRT. Consider the weaponization of humor, and specifically of ridicule. Per Alinsky, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. There is no defense. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage. Ridicule is particularly powerful when it is directed against dominant or hegemonic norms and values. This is because the dominance of these norms depend on the public respect they command. Ridicule was a potent weapon for radicals when they were on the outside, in the counterculture. Having all but won their cultural revolution, opponents of radicalism are the new counterculture. Ridicule is among our most potent weapons. This is the context in which we approach online trolling campaigns and political meme culture. Consider a few such examples targeting the mainstream news media. Number 1, for decades, the conventional wisdom held that people negatively impacted by globalization would adjust to resulting job losses and limited employment prospects by simply retooling their own skill sets. One stand-in for this view was the phrase, learn to code. Opponents of globalization considered learn to code to be an elitist, let-them-eat-cake counter-response to what was, in their view, a series of government policy-driven changes to the structure of the American economy. Consequently, in 2019, when many journalists, that is, former enthusiastic propagators of this conventional wisdom, faced a severely worsening job market, their critics tweeted to them, learn to code. Number 2, members of the group QAnon believe, among other things, that the U.S. government is run by a secret cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who manage a global sex trafficking ring. They further believe that President Trump was recruited by the military to expose this cabal and to bring it to justice. It is a strange movement, to put it mildly, but it is also a very pro-Trump movement, as one might expect. That is, if the choice is between Trump on the one hand and Satanist pedophiles on the other. Left-leaning media pundits have responded by associating Republicans and conservative viewpoints with QAnon and by working to legitimize conservative views as conspiracy theories. In response, some conservative activists embrace the term Blue Anon as a stand-in for, as they see it, discredited liberal conspiracies like the Russia collusion investigation, the Jussie Smollett hate crime hoax, the Covington Catholic kid scandal, and the idea that the U.S. government is presently under threat from a right-wing insurgency. Number 3, family. In response to perceptions of widespread reflective press hostility towards President Trump, his supporters created the NPC meme. In video games, an NPC refers to a non-player character. NPCs engage with players in limited, formulaic fashions, for example, repeating the same lines. In the NPC meme, journalists repeat the phrase, "Orange Man bad," in unison because they, like a simple video game character, lack the ability to engage with players, the public, in greater depth. In each case, guerrilla tactics ridicule dominant institutions and so assault their legitimacy. Learn to Code and Blue Anon accuse the institution of hypocrisy. Learn to Code demands that dominant actors live by their own standards, another Linsky tactic. Blue Anon takes aim at the press as an authority on matters of fact and fiction, its very raison d'etre. The NPC meme highlights media bias, impartiality being, believe it or not, another key source of news media legitimacy. As if to prove Alinsky's observative, Twitter-banned Learn to Code and the NPC meme allegedly to safeguard its users. Doing so only compounds the damage by demonstrating the vulnerability of the dominant paradigm to childish criticism. Not that trust in media is hard to begin with. After Blue Anon was removed from the Urban Dictionary and censored from the internet searches by Google, the term became a top trender on Twitter. In terms of guerrilla tactics more directly relevant to CRT, consider the white saviors meme constructed from the popular show Game of Thrones. The white savior complex is yet another indictment leveled at white people by woke anti-racists. The claim is that whites often ostentatiously help people of color to aggrandize themselves. The white savior GOT meme flips this accusation back onto the white CRT proponent, accusing them of grandstanding and, implicitly, of hypocrisy. The picture depicts the white savior, Daenerys Targaryen, surrounded by a sea of dark-skinned worshippers. The caption reads, "How white people see themselves when they post anti-white posts." This meme is hard-hitting, salient, and above all, funny. Wherever possible, we should be happy warriors. At the same time, there are some definite perils to avoid when using guerrilla tactics to combat CRT. Certainly, the online meme world has its share of people and content, for example, the alt-right, that would tar our resistance movement by association. CRT proponents would endeavor to draw such connections whenever possible, and there is no reason for us to make it easy for them to do so. As opponents of critical race theory, we are opponents of racism, not of racism as absurdly reimagined by CRT, but of actual racism, of hating and or believing people to be superior or inferior based on their race. We must hold our own standards even while demolishing those of our opponents. Don't despair. If these strategies seem a bit too complicated, our next chapter presents 10 concrete recommendations that offer a multi-pronged attack on CRT's radical agenda. We are encouraged that the battle is winnable and that Americans are standing up and fighting back in a bold and efficacious manner. Study questions. Question 1. What institutions has CRT influenced? Number 2, why do businesses embrace CRT? Number 3, what considerations are important in developing resistance tactics? Number 4, how does the framework, voice, exit, and guerrilla warfare relate to fighting back against CRT? Chapter 8, Fighting Back. This book is all about action. It is a call for the "We the People" addressed in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution to be the people who take a stand for the guiding principles that have undergirded our nation and made it the envy of the world. Our goal has been to inform you about CRT, a dangerous ideology that has indoctrinated millions of Americans and taken over many of our institutions. In this final chapter, we provide an action plan for combating CRT. Several of the proposals we list speak to public policy and call for your support in terms of your advocacy, volunteerism, and/or contributions, whatever you can reasonably do. Politics and public policy have the greatest potential to influence every other institution of American society. Policy is where CRT can inflict the most damage, and so it is where we must concentrate much of our resistance efforts. At the same time, there's a world beyond politics that is likewise under siege. We therefore include suggestions for how you can resist CRT in your personal life and help to construct a culture where others can do the same. We list our 10 proposals below for quick reference and then explain them in greater detail in the following section. We conclude this chapter and book with a list of resources you can use to learn more about CRT in theory and in practice, and where you can go to find allies in this fight. 10 proposals for resisting CRT. Number 1, continue to research what CRT is, where it comes from, how it impacts American society, and how to combat its influence. Number 2, challenge the legality and constitutionality of CRT in education and in the workplace. Number 3, organize grassroots movements to elect school boards, city council members, and mayors to eliminate CRT and related indoctrination within their respective domains. For example, 1619 curriculums. Number 4, build broad coalitions stretching across racial, ethnic, and partisan divides. Number 5, use multiple strategies including town hall meetings, writing op-eds, contacting public officials, and organizing rallies to share information about the harm caused by CRT to children and to others. Number 6, educate church leaders and encourage them to lead on racial issues using principles of biblical justice. Number 7, bring pressure to bear on corporations and other institutions that support CRT. Number 8, stand up to big tech companies that seek to limit political speech. Number 9, monitor state and local agencies to ensure that taxpayers are not subsidizing organizations that advance hostility to America and to its American values. Number 10, develop alternatives to diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Applying the proposals. Number 1, understanding CRT. We think that the most important contribution this book makes is in emphasizing strategies and tactics for resisting CRT in practice. At the same time, we have discussed what we believe are the most essential aspects of CRT because we want you to know your enemy, to paraphrase Sun Tzu, credited as the author of the classic work, The Art of War. Of course, much more has been written on the subject, and we encourage you to avail yourself of as many resources as you can. We list many such resources in Appendix A, found in the accompanying PDF. However, briefly, Readers who are interested in other scholarly accounts should consider Cynical Theories, 2020, by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. Readers interested in critical race theory's penetration of Christianity and of the military should consider Fault Lines, 2021, by Vodi Bakum, and Irresistible Revolution, 2020, by Matthew Lohmeyer. These last two are recent books written by a Christian minister and a former Space Force commander, respectively. For online resources, we recommend Critical Race Theory, The New Intolerance, and Its Grip on America by Butcher and Gonzalez, 2020, and The New Discourses, Social Justice Encyclopedia for comprehensive accounts of CRT in theory. For accounts of CRT in practice, we encourage our readers to peruse Christopher Rufo's considerable work as well as his CRT legislation tracker. Number 2, challenging CRT under law. As discussed in Chapter 6, parents, students, employees, and citizen activists are taking a stand by challenging CRT's implementation on legal and constitutional grounds. We shared the concerns of CRT's legal critics that CRT instruction in K-12 schools and in workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion training violates First and 14th Amendment protections as well as civil rights law. It should be emphasized that this conflict is fundamental. It is not a technical matter that CRT proponents can tweak to save CRT instruction in practice. If courts remove from CRT instruction racial harassment and discrimination, hostile learning and working environments, compelled confessions of racial guilt, retribution for noncompliance, and racial segregation, what remains would not be CRT in any meaningful sense. You can help these efforts by gathering and publicizing evidence. For example, school curricular, policy, memoranda, training documents of abusive CRT practices. You can pass information along to organizations such as No Left Turn in Education and to other leaders in this fight. You can also take legal action yourself if you feel that your rights have been violated. We also recommend for your reading a letter to and legal response from the Secretary of State in Montana that stops CRT in its tracks. Number 3, building grassroots resistance movements. Across the nation, parents are mobilizing and taking decisive action to remove CRT from school curricula. Recently, in South Lake, Texas, CRT opponents secured a landslide local election victory. At the time of this writing, statewide CRT curriculum bans had been proposed in 11 states and passed in 4: Tennessee, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Idaho. In Appendix B, found in the accompanying PDF, we include a model school board CRT ban provided by Citizens for Renewing America. This is something tangible that you can personally take to your school board to put an end to CRT indoctrination in schools in your community. This is representative government at its best, popular mobilization driving institutional change. We need to ramp up the pressure. We need more grassroots groups, more petitions, more phone calls, emails, and letters to politicians and school administrators, more active school board involvement, more protests, all of it. We have 46 states to go. An important aside is that such efforts are not, and should not be, prohibitions of discussing slavery, Jim Crow, or other examples of where the United States has failed to live up to its ideals. A proper education in American history requires learning and discussing such facts. Simply put, CRT is a matter of narrative, not of fact. CRT is a story about America, one that is explicitly hostile to American identity and values. Other stories, perspectives on American history and society could include the white supremacist perspective, the monarchist perspective, the government is run by lizard people perspective, excluding inaccurate and divisive narratives that does not limit the free speech rights of students or teachers. As Rufo notes, the specific language of CRT bans prohibiting race essentialism, collective guilt, and racial superiority theory would prevent racist instruction of any kind. Monarchist and lizard people narratives remain untouched, however. As parents and citizens invested in our country's future, we have a responsibility to ensure that school curricula are accurate and that they serve the public interest by helping to mold future citizens capable of sustaining a free society. To this end, we should set up 1776 mini commissions at the state and local levels. Such commissions would mirror efforts by the previous 1776 Commission and by the Woodson Center's 1776 Unites to replace divisive and inaccurate 1619-inspired curricula with a curriculum that is accurate, patriotic, and racially unifying. Such curricula should emphasize America's true founding principles and date, 1776, as well as the successes achieved and contributions made by Americans of all backgrounds to our shared history, society, and culture. We should also look to K-12 school districts around the country for examples of excellent curricula we can model and replicate. Number 4, building broad coalitions. We need a mass movement of resistance to overcome CRT's stranglehold on institutions. We need to organize parents and other concerned citizens, speak out in public forums, contact public officials, pressure candidates, hold rallies, and generally create the impression and reality of an overwhelming movement. To this end, we should view ourselves as partisans of the American tradition and set aside other disputes. The broader and more diverse, politically, racially, etc., our movement is, the more effective it will be. This is particularly true where racial diversity is concerned. It is a simple fact that CRT's premises render it especially vulnerable to criticism from racial minorities and, in particular, to criticisms from the eternal victims in the CRT worldview, Black Americans. Number 5, getting the word out. Defeating CRT demands an all-hands-on-deck approach. We inform ourselves first, Proposal 1, and then we inform others. We can do the latter using op-eds and letters to the editor, and we can share our views with friends and colleagues, including on social media. Letters to public officials, rallies, and town hall engagement all magnify our message and signal strength. Numbers and commitment. Such efforts are beginning to show signs of success. As we work to spread the word about CRT, it might be most effective to emphasize what CRT looks like in practice. CRT's strength is that it preys on people's empathy for the downtrodden and for the disadvantaged, though, ironically, CRT diminishes empathy by circumscribing it to favored groups. Understanding CRT's premises and origins takes time. Not that we have to tell you this in the final chapter of this book, but a deep dive into theory is not required for most people to understand why, for example, it is both unjust and cruel to force small children to feel shame for their racial identity and for historical injustices over which they had no control. To justify CRT in practice, one needs either a very hard heart or a considerable deprogramming of one's natural moral instincts. Number 6, engaging the churches. America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Church, the SBC, is presently embroiled in a controversy stemming from a 2019 resolution bringing CRT into the church. Similar splits exist elsewhere in the Christian church. However, the SBC case is especially striking in that the two sides seemingly agree on questions of doctrine, moral traditionalism, and even on the question of CRT's anti-Christian foundations. The split over CRT is rather an extension of the nation's racial divide. That any orthodox and informed Christian could view CRT positively speaks to the depth of this wound. CRT proponents in the church are rightly focused on confronting racism. However, supplanting Christianity with Marxism is plainly wrong. By any decent measure, the woke church is an abomination. Christianity provides a firm foundation for viewing one another as equals and for treating each other with love and dignity. It provides no foundation for viewing one another as natural enemies or for retribution against entire groups in the name of social justice. The fact that so many Christians fail to see the imago Dei in their fellow man in the past does not excuse, much less necessitate repeating this failure in the present. Use your knowledge to help church leaders remove CRT's divisive rhetoric from their congregations. Number 7, confronting woke institutions. President Trump's now rescinded ban on CRT training in federal agencies should be reinstated, and state government should follow his lead as Arkansas already has. We need more action on this front. At all levels of government, we should be pushing for changes to fiscal and regulatory policy to make life more difficult for companies who push CRT on their employees and easier for those who do not. Tax shelters for foundations and nonprofits that fund CRT should be scrapped. Employee civil rights protections should be aggressively enforced and indeed extended to encourage employees to sue companies for subjecting them to diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, workforce training. If there are additional grounds on which to target CRT companies, anti-competitive practices, for example, we should pursue those as well. In addition, we believe that no compelling public interest is served by instructing young Americans to hate their country and their fellow citizens. As such, we can think of no reason for government to continue to subsidize CRT college instruction through grants and loans. Obviously, students should be free to take whatever course they're willing to pay for themselves. Policymakers should also consider the academic and broader societal merits of related, heavily Marxist-influenced fields. Certainly, degrees in CRT and perhaps in related fields should be delisted from fulfilling education requirements for government hiring purposes. Moving beyond public policy, we can incorporate the principles of voice, exit, and guerrilla warfare described in the previous chapter into our efforts to dissuade major institutions from pushing CRT. Briefly, you can voice your objections to CRT public rhetoric and to DEI training. If, for example, you are a major stockholder or supplier to a woke business, or even if you're just a consumer of business products, we all are, you have leverage. If the institution fails to relent, you can exert additional pressure by depriving it of your resources, exit, your money, your time, etc. Finally, we can think of non-voice, exit approaches to combating CRT in the institutions as figurative guerrilla warfare tactics, working to undermine the legitimacy of CRT promoting institutions. Number 8. Standing up to big tech. In terms of woke institutions, America's dominant technology companies and social media platforms Big tech deserves special consideration. The problem is not merely that these major companies, like so many others, have embraced CRT. For example, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey donated $10 billion to Ibram X. Kendi's Center for Anti-Racist Research. Rather, it is that they routinely leverage their monopoly control to mandate the CRT worldview by excluding dissenting voices from the nation's digital commons. Examples of big tech censorship and other abusive practices include 1. Blocking, banning, shadow banning, and demonetizing users expressing disfavored views. 2. Shielding favored viewpoints, groups, and individuals from criticism. 3. Ignoring some kinds of hate speech, threats, and other abusive practices, for example, doxing, even by their own standards. 4. Interfering in U.S. elections by censoring important news stories and by deplatforming candidates as well as the former president. And 5. Defending such actions by suggesting that critics form their own platforms while simultaneously coordinating to sabotage such platforms. Thankfully, Florida is leading the way in reining in these abusive and discriminatory practices, and other states are following suit. Policymakers should consider adding political viewpoint discrimination to existing civil rights protections. Ultimately, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act must be altered or repealed at the federal level. As elsewhere, your advocacy is needed here. 9. Monitoring state and local agencies to ensure that taxpayers are not subsidizing organizations that advance hostility to America and to American values. There are many ways you can monitor state and local government agencies in your area. Check your local city and county websites for committee meeting minutes, agendas, and dates when practicable. For information not available online, you can submit a Freedom of Information Act FOIA request at your local government's office. The National Conference of State Legislatures offers searchable databases that allow you to watch for pending legislation in areas that CRT can affect, like education. These and other resources will help you stay abreast of any attempts to use taxpayer dollars to support CRT. 10. Developing alternatives to diversity, equity, and inclusion training programs. We believe CRT has metastasized in the workplace because it addresses a real need, namely that companies have diverse workforces. In general, diversity, difference is an asset to companies in that it brings additional perspectives to bear on tasks. However, diversity becomes a liability when those different perspectives clash in unproductive ways. In this way, diversity is like a force of nature, for example, like fire. Harness it properly and reap the rewards. Fail to do so and get burned. We find that too many companies are being pushed into bringing in diversity trainers whose destructive messages create havoc in the workplace and leave people much worse off. Fortunately, there is an alternative. President Biden has reversed the Trump executive orders banning CRT in federal agencies and issued several new orders of his own designed to address discrimination against marginalized groups and underdeserved populations. Institutions face enormous pressures to take action. Instead of hiring DEI trainers steeped in CRT, we need to compete in this space before workplaces and learning environments are disrupted. It is possible to educate people about diversity and to be sensitive to the needs and contributions of others without pitting men against women, whites against blacks, and the LGBT members against heterosexuals. My beliefs motivated me to take action. I urge other entrepreneurs to do the same. After the social and political unrest of 2020, I created Unity Training Solutions as an alternative to the plethora of DEI programs that use critical race theory as their ideological framework. DEI training is layered on top of existing affirmative action programs, which are the law of the land. Recent studies show that DEI training does not achieve its lofty goals. It is a billion-dollar industry that lacks monitoring and professional standards of conduct that one would expect from people who are preaching to us about how we should educate our children and run our businesses and workplaces. Unity Training Solutions brings together diverse people who seek harmony and are willing to commit themselves to work on common goals and common visions for their institutions. Traditional American principles and old-fashioned common sense would suggest we can achieve greater harmony and success in institutions by respecting everyone's civil rights and equality under the law. We can accomplish this by rediscovering and re-embracing our nation's motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one. I believe most Americans hold a vision of diversity and inclusion that recognizes and appreciates the individuality each person brings to the environment. Justice and fairness can be obtained while respecting free speech and transparency. Indeed, the citizens of our nation share more similarities than differences. The goal of diversity training should be to help diverse people work together and respect each other without bringing unnecessary drama and distractions to workplaces and learning environments. Stand your ground. We now know that CRT impacts us in myriad ways, including at work and in our private lives. Part of the reason we find ourselves on our respective back feet is that too many of us fear being labeled racist and otherwise stigmatized by CRT proponents. When confronted by such people, you can and should stand your ground. Doing so will not be easy, but it is the right thing to do. We should have the courage to take principled stances that can be persuasive and powerful. Stand up for yourself, for your children, and for others who are unfairly targeted by the social justice mob. Your courage will help others to do the same.
You've been listening to the audio production of Black Eye for America. Text copyright 2021 by Carol M. Swain and Christopher J. Shore. Production copyright 2021 by Carol M. Swain. No portion of this recording may be reproduced without the prior written consent of the publisher. For more information on Dr. Carol M. Swain, please visit carolmswain.com. Christopher Shore can be reached at christophershore, SCHORR.com. Black Eye for America was recorded at the Reading Room by Nashville Audio Productions.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.